Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of speaking with Layman Pascal, who I have had the complete delight of having conversations with recently over at Philosophy Portal with Cadell Last on systems and subjects. We talked about religion with Dimitri. Had the pleasure. Layman Pascal was just absolutely outstanding talking about belonging again, and I really appreciated that. And Layman Pascal, a gift to the internet is the work being done at the integral stage. It's really a place with him and Bruce Alderman, the education that you can get from there is truly invaluable, especially in this time between worlds, where we need thinking that is so integrative, that's bringing together all these different kinds of thought, levels of thought together in a place that we can think. Because one of our great challenges today is thinking across fields and across different disciplines and learning how to attune ourselves to all of that complexity. Because if we don't become more able to handle complexity, the world is still going to get more complex, and that might prove to be a problem if we're not so ready for it. Layman Pascal is a tremendous speaker and interviewer and host, and I am delighted to have a chance to speak to him today on shamanism. And so, Layman Pascal, if I would ask you, what is shamanism? What does that mean to you? Why do you think it's valuable? And also, you have a lovely line in your essay where you say, a renaissance is needed for a meta-crisis, on that book you did with Jonathan Rowson. You edited together, which I enjoyed very much. I had the pleasure of reading your piece, Zach Stein, who I always enjoy. Jeremy Johnson had a wonderful piece on Gesper. But you had a lovely line in there on Renaissance and its relation to metacrises. And then the topic of shamanism in general seems very important today. So when I throw all that at you, Layman Pascal, or if another way to put it, if my daughter brings home somebody to, like, if my daughter brings somebody home and that person tells me they're a shaman, what should I expect that to mean?
Well, the first thing that comes up for me, which is a little bit tangential, is my memories of putting that book together, because I had to go over and edit and work with each of the contributors about their pieces. So I would turn them into audio material and listen to them. So for every chapter in that book, I have a physical location where I was listening to it. And Zach Stein's piece, this is very vivid to me. I was working under the deck all day when I went through Zach Stein's piece, trying to slope so that the water, when the snow melts, would run away from the house. So for me, Zach Stein's article is under my deck. uh, yeah, well, if your daughter brings home a shaman, you really have no idea what to expect, because anybody
Nice.
can obviously use that word to mean anything they want. And there's some pretty dubious people who would want to call themselves shamans. When I think of shamanism, what I mean is something like a continuity of human spiritual and religious and wisdom cultivation practices that operate before and between and outside of cultural identities. That recognizes and trains people who are instinctively oriented towards certain types of experiences, altered state experiences, ritual production, embodied psychology, kind of animistic pluralism, dialoguing with complex non-human intelligences, building skill in the imaginal, working with subtle energy, subconscious intelligence, things like that. My sense is there's a subset of the species that recurs pretty regularly, that exhibits a class of neuroatypicalities that a healthy society would recognize and support and allow co-training and social promotion of, so that we can get the best out of these characters, because they have an important role to play in the functioning of the village, so to speak, even if by village we mean a global village. And I think especially when we look at what the situation in the world is today, like metacrisis is a word that we've coined to describe our plural convergent crises that have some kind of generator functions in common and have some kind of transformation of our thinking and feeling that's necessary in order to handle them. But the categories of things that are involved in the metacrisis are sets of problems that correspond pretty well to the classical and imaginary shamanic skill sets, right? We've got a pharmaceutical crisis. Is there a type of person who traditionally specialized in pharmaceutical wisdom? We've got a meaning crisis. Is there a type of person historically who specialized in producing meaning and producing the sacred, right? We have a sort of social identity problem that depends on whether or not we can enact ritual together. Were there anciently specialists in ritual? Yes, there were. So you start going down this list. A huge one is ecology. We have an enormous problem in terms of how the human species socially is relating to the ecology on this planet. Is there anciently a kind of person who specialized in the relationship between the human settlement and the ecological situation? Yes, there is. So you can build up this notion that the cluster of skills we associate classically with shamanism is the one that corresponds roughly to the cluster of problems we face in terms of the meta crisis defining our world historical moment.
That's an excellent answer. So first, I'm made to remember how Augustine would talk about like a mind map, like a mind temple, where he'd put certain ideas in certain rooms, and when he went there, he'd remember it. So you've done that with your deck. So when you go under your deck, you know, you think about Zach Stein. So that's a wonderful idea to edit different essays in different places. I think Augustine would like that with his kind of mind temple thing. And so the first question I have, I think a lot of people hear the word shaman and might think guru or teacher, and obviously words mean lots of things to lots of people, and words are very sticky. And maybe it's a very good strategy for that guy that, you know, my daughter brings home to like say shaman, because I won't know what it is and I'll have to listen to him. So it might be a really good strategy. So if I were to ask you, is there a difference between shaman and guru or not? How would you respond to that, sir?
Yeah, guru and teacher are typically particular social roles that could be populated by people who have any number of different skill sets, capacities, and maturational levels.
Mm,
So when I would speak of shamanism, and normally now I speak of meta-shamanism because I
mm.
don't quite want to associate it with just traditionally inherited shamanic, culturally embedded roles. I'm looking at something a little bit larger than that. But these cluster of capacities I was talking about, by which you would recognize somebody with, let's say, organic hierophantic capacity, sort of a natural shaman, that kind of person could become a guru or a spiritual teacher or a religious mentor in any number of ways. And that could be legitimate or illegitimate, could be healthy or unhealthy. But just because someone is occupying that kind of an authority position doesn't mean they're at all aligned with these shamanic capacities. Right. I think one of the problems we've seen over the last several thousand years of religion is a tendency to promote people into those positions for reasons other than matured competence in shamanic capacity. And that's probably one of the reasons why religion has A, fallen on hard times in the modern civilization, but B, been prone to very disastrous, suppressive, unhealthy, and essentially sacrilegious activities.
Mm. No, I think it's a wonderful answer. And it makes me think of how you talk about museums of religion and how many religions today are more so museums than they are places of the actual practice or lived life of religion, because there seems to be something very deep there, but there also seems to be a tendency of that depth to become something very empty. And perhaps everything in human life has a possibility of becoming empty if we're not actively cultivating and keeping it alive. And maybe that's one of the things that the shaman can teach us, is that actually we have to be very active. Well, is there then, you know, what you're saying makes me think of Ivan Illich, and he talks about institutions, and he talks about the medical apparatus, the educational apparatus, and he talks about where Christianity basically died is when it moved in the direction of becoming an institution. And he makes an example of the Good Samaritan, where when you come up, you know, the question is when they ask Jesus, who is your neighbor? And Jesus then tells this story because, you know, he likes to be difficult and give you a story which would require you to think as opposed to an answer. And the idea is the neighbor is the person you come upon. You know, you just come upon it. And, you know, Ivan Illich points out that the people asking the question, they're looking for like a principle or a moral law, when really what Jesus gives them is a story, which kind of resists codification, institutionalization. And Ivan really wants to kind of emphasize the skill, the activity. And he says, you know, what we see in Jesus is giving stories of discernment, action, having the ability, having the resources to take care of the person on the street. But there's some sort of tendency where you already see in the Sadducees and the Pharisees to want to institutionalize. Okay, tell me who my neighbor is so I can write it down. And then whenever I see that person, I know who it is. Okay, tell me what it means to love. I'll write it down and then I'll follow that. And what Ivan Illich wants to say is we have to resist that. And he goes, then he'll make examples of how we need to resist that in education, resist that in medicine, you noted. You know, he's big on environmentalism. He talks about how once water became H2O, per se, and it lost its beauty and poetic resonance, then it was basically going to become Heidegger's standing reserve, and how to kind of save the environment. We have to return to the art of being human so that we see H2O as water, not just H2O. And so he's resisting all of these institutional tendencies precisely to keep the activity of religion, of Christianity for him, in the realm of the live. the live human discernment, the live art of acting. And would you say that the shaman has something to do with that sort of activity versus something more institutionalized? Because it seems like the guru, or the teacher, is more of an institutional setting, and that a shaman could be in an institutional setting and still be a shaman, but they may not be, because they maybe could be an outsourcing of that to the institution. And basically what Ivan Illich is saying is there's something in human nature that wants to outsource what we should keep in the human to institutions, and it's very, very difficult not to do that. So is there something where we can associate the shaman as the guy responding to the person on the side of the street live, in the guru, someone in the building telling you who your neighbor is and telling you how to love?
Yeah, for me, the shamanic is very closely aligned with the personal, the organic, and the authentic, something like that, right? Where we are, because human beings have a tendency to sort of collapse their experience of the world into flat, socially acceptable modes where they don't have to put much cognitive effort into what they're perceiving. You need somebody to specialize in revitalizing and giving new meaning to human experience, or it will naturally flatten itself out. So without a healthy, robust, hierophantic caste of some kind that's specifically focused on re-authenticizing our experience in any kind of institution, then those institutions will tend to become empty and flattened, right? So there's no real, the fact of an institution is not itself the problem, and there are various degrees of complexity of institution. And one of the things we hope a robust shamanic intelligence in civilization would do is help us move toward institutions that are themselves structured in ways that more closely resemble human vitality. But the main thing they have to do is help the individuals and the communities and the cultural field reestablish connection with the reality and the meaning of the things that it's engaged in. Otherwise, you're going to default into social flatness. And even though you're nominally doing the right thing, you're not getting any of the benefits anymore. And so you see this accumulating social catastrophe, which is essentially the result of the social substituting for the actual, much in the same way. I love this metaphor of trans fats. As it was explained to me, trans fats are not themselves toxic, but they toxify the body because they replace the function of the healthy fats. Right. So the social is not itself problematic, but where it substitutes for other dimensions of human experience, it tends to generate a kind of a toxic outcome.
That's lovely. And that makes me think of, you were talking about the gestalt of health in the essay, and the notion that there are all these different parts that have to be coordinated for the optimal outcome. And if not, if one piece is off or something's maybe overemphasized and it's not attuned to everything else, then you get something very problematic. It also makes me think of where Mr. Alex Ebert will talk about how cancer is a result of cells refusing to die. So they're unwilling to die. So life gets out of balance, although I know that's a loaded phrase. It gets out of whack, if you will, with death. And as a result, it becomes cancerous. And it's very interesting to think, I like that metaphor from Mr. Ebert, because it does seem to suggest a truth about a more general state of life, where you don't really want to have no institutions, but then if institutions do all your thinking for you, then they become cancerous. They don't know their place, right? Likewise, you don't want human beings to never, say, be in community, but then if they're never alone, to say work on their inner work, they never have that solitude, then when they're in community, they can become more parasitic because they're more needy, but not in a way that's more of a kind of giving, right? So there's something about the human condition that requires this very intricate sort of seeing where the boundaries of things are, precisely to know where they fit, so that you get something more like a painting, right? Like if there's no boundary to the color blue in the Mona Lisa, it's going to be one hideous picture. But the boundary is what makes possible the gestalt of the entire picture, right? And would you say what's taken to me, like in reading that article with the shaman, is there something about the shaman that is trying to, dare I say, teach or cultivate the ability for people to live according to more of a sense of gestalt, versus, say, a monotheory, as I like to call it, a theory of everything by which you understand everything, and then you end up overfitting it, like in computer science, we talk about overfitting, underfitting it. I'm always worried I'm using those wrongs, but I'm going to try anyway, where you take a theory like, if you have a model of the bookcase and you underfit it, it's not similar enough to the bookcase to be useful, so it's underfit. But if you overfit it, then it's too complex because it's too much like the bookcase. So why is it even a model, right? Like a model works because it's wrong, but not so wrong that then you can't use it, right? So a good theory finds, I think it's like bi-fitting is the term between it, right? So we're always looking for bi-fitting. We're always looking for theories that bi-fit or whatever, that don't overfit or underfit. And that right there puts you in the realm of Gestalt, because that would mean you need many models, many theories, and then to figure out where one works and where one does not. So is there something about shamanism that is in the business of Gestalt, that is in the training of that ability to discern it? And would you associate that with the term like wisdom, which I know is another loaded term that means a lot of things for a lot of people, but is there something about wisdom in all of that?
Yes, I mean, I think if you were looking for people who were focused on a Gestalt type approach, one of the things you could look for would be the presence of a naturalistic orientation and a pluralistic orientation, right? People would think there's some distributed set of factors we have to take into account, and there's some ideal we have about how to bring those together in order to produce some sort of positive functionality. And when we look back at the shamanic and some of the early pagan traditions generally, we see pantheons, we see an animistic mentality, we see the idea of approaching psychology and cosmology as a distributed interactive system that getting the balances of correct will result in the presence of the divine in the world, so to speak. Right? I think we see that, and I also think from my own tendencies to define religion and spirituality in a pluralistic integrative manner, what I would suggest is you can sort of retro-engineer the historical practices of religion and spirituality through the lens of generating a coherent excess from a variety of different thematic kinds of intelligence within a system. And the shamanic sort of becomes the esoteric, both within religion and in sort of the social underground over the course of recorded history. But we could still associate it with that fundamental wisdom production strategy that was used by our ancestors in what was the largest period of human history, which is pre-recorded history, right? You have 100 to 200,000 years of this kind of activity and a couple thousand years of this kind of activity. So the normal form of wisdom production is more closely associated with this shamanic esoteric style. I think the argument for the Gestalt approach is stronger in terms of spirituality and religion than in terms of wisdom production. I think there's a lot of overlap. But I think you could get various forms of wisdom production that are a little bit more specific, a little bit more targeted than sort of, because when you're trying to become wise, I think all of the procedures of wisdom production could be analyzed in a Gestalt fashion, but you're developing something very specific. Whereas if you're working on religion and spirituality, it's an extremely expanded thing, right? There's some transcendental transfiguring excess that's involved, which isn't necessarily always the case with wisdom work. But they're very closely aligned.
Excellent. I really like that answer, and it makes me think. So there's always this problem, like where, for example, if one is trying to come up with, say, a non-reductionist theory or a theory that does not reduce everything into the same in kind, in a sense, that is describing the whole. That's a kind of Gestalt, right? And yet it's a whole, it's a whole that entails many Gestalts that are irreducible to one another, right? And yet in of itself, it's a kind of whole that's an operation. And there's always this problem of language. Like, so for example, if I would use the phrase used with Hegel sometime of absolute idealism or the absolute knowing and all that, definitely sounds like he's saying there's some sort of enlightenment stack where you know everything, right? Where Zizek and then other, even like Merold Westphal, who's from the 70s or different things, where he writes where the absolute is actually the knowing of the absolute limit of knowing, and that there's absolutely some sort of level of irreducibility of other things, and yet they work in a kind of harmony. It's like the difference between everyone playing violin in an orchestra and making the same sound versus an orchestra consisting of many instruments making the same, like Beethoven's Ninth, and yet Beethoven's Ninth is precisely possible as a Gestalt, as a kind of whole, thanks to the irreducibility of all these different parts. And so it's very difficult to even talk about kind of an irreducible theory or some sort of idea of this constant practice that isn't of shamanism, perhaps, that is always in operation without making it sound like a theory of everything. And yet it's a theory that entails many particular details. And I think that can happen with wisdom as well, right? There can be a wisdom that is a certain sort of, oh, when I'm in situation X, maybe Y tends to be what works, but then also the wisdom to realize that Y doesn't work in that situation, which is part of the very wisdom that would sort of note that Y may work in that situation. So this very active imagination, this sort of active wisdom. And I also like the point that you're getting at on how thousands of years, the kind of wisdom that might be what we need today would be aligned with a more shamanistic religion, animalistic, like prehistoric religion. And it does seem that maybe it's difficult to think wisdom in that sense now because, like Ivan Illich is saying, the introduction of institutions, the introduction of different systems and so on and so forth, which in some respects seems to be dealing with the problem of scale, because when you have many different people of many different diversities, how do you deal with that other than systematize it? And the beauty of a system is that it works even without human beings being involved. It doesn't matter what the difference is, it still works. It doesn't need the human element. But the terror of system is precisely that it works without the human element, right? And arguably a lot of the meta crisis is the consequent, maybe the unintentional consequences of the solutions to scale problems that have turned out to have cancerous consequences, which would then align with the need to return to something more active in our thinking, like shamanism and different things. Well, if I were to ask you an example of, say, a wisdom practice or something of wisdom. So, for example, like someone will say, you know, have a long-term horizon, not a short-term horizon, right? Like, don't think about the immediate, think about the long-term. That's pretty wise. But that sounds like a principle. So that could be problematic because maybe there's, you know, you need to be present today, right? You're so focused on the long term that you're not present and everyone's kind of disembodied. How would a shaman go about thinking about sort of a wisdom principle like that, or any wisdom principle you want to speak about? Because I'm very interested in how a shaman would think about a principle like that and how they'd approach it differently as opposed to maybe a teacher who would just sit off the top of the desk and tell everyone, look to the future, don't worry about today. My impression of a teacher is someone who tells that, and then you walk out of the room and go, the heck does that mean? What does it mean to look like? Or you follow that, and therefore you miss some of the joys of today. So I'd be curious on how a shaman might approach that differently, or how they might teach it differently, or how they would go about sharing it differently, or any example of wisdom.
I mean, I think the approach that we might want to call shamanic is something that would focus very much on transformative personal experience to back up these principles or to underwrite them. And without that experience, it's just another piece, it's another social artifact that may or may not be implemented, right? So there's a couple ways to think about that. One is traditionally the shamanic is going to do a lot of its educational work in nature, where it's surrounded by unfolding complex natural processes that it can then imaginally use as thought tools and which can help direct its thinking on these subjects, because it's not an arbitrary, purely social and symbolic attempt to extend our concerns into the future. We want to do that in a way that's harmonized with other complex systems that have also figured out ways to extend themselves into the future. And that's something we see distributed throughout the entire biosphere. So there's that aspect to it. There's the altered state experiences of various kinds, whether they come from internal practices or plant medicines or social encounters. Those put you into states where you have the ability to almost directly observe and viscerally feel the reality of extended frames of time. So it's not merely a proposal that we should be focused on as a mentally recollected principle. It's something we've actually seen, it's something we've actually felt that involves more levels of our being. And that's where I think shamanism and wisdom production come really close together, because in both cases, you need to involve more than just the relatively superficial left brain waking state intellect, right? At the very least, you need to involve your somatic experience, your emotional experience, your interpersonal experience, the life of your cells. The lion's share of your intelligence is unconscious intelligence. So how do you work with that? You work with it through altered states. You work with it through imaginal experiences. You work with it by trying to bring other aspects of yourself into confrontation with those principles. right? What is it emotionally to assimilate a principle like that? What is it physically to assimilate? How would your neuromuscular system attempt to articulate that principle so that that could be complementary to your mental attempt to articulate that principle? So I think that that coordination of different internal intelligence systems allows us to turn a knowing into an understanding, which is a different way of languaging what it is to become wise, to understand as opposed to simply know. And that involves the increased coordination of different internal systems, which I would also say is the heart of spiritual practice, and that spiritual practice has its historical origin in the shamanic styles of spirituality.
That's absolutely excellent. It makes me think, it seems like part of the issue is, if I just make an example of Christianity, that the movement from Christianity, from being like Christ to, say, being saved, resulted in a movement of having the right ideas versus like living the right way, as Ivan Illich was saying. So for example, when Paul, as Harold Bloom talks about, if Romans is read as the Roman road, what you need to do in order to be saved, then there's a loss of emphasis, say, on the skills and the abilities that are needed to, and that kind of misses what I think would be a more shamanic, if you will, Christianity or reading of Paul, where Paul is trying to respond actively to situations that Christ never spoke about directly, that no one has any idea about. Say, should you eat this bread on the altar to another god or not? No one knows, and Paul is trying to actively think through in light of, say, the revelation of Christ and lived experience, and it's an active thought. People say read Paul as laying down dogma, and therefore kind of miss the principle of active imagination that we might see in that, or active discernment, which would be more shamanic. And instead, what we do is we end up with kind of a notion of Paul and Christianity in general of, here are the beliefs that you need to have, and then you're saved. And there's not really the emphasis on personal transformation. You could argue it doesn't have to be that way, but what Ivan Illich is kind of warning on and continually is that it has been that way. And so a return, I like this idea on what you're saying on the shamanic having so much to do with this personal transformation, because it would seem like instead, the more you move toward the institutional side, you move from quality to quantification. And it seems to be what you're describing is this quality of life and experience that the shaman is very interested in, precisely to make sure that one is coordinating themselves in a manner that is fully human. And I like the emphasis as well on the ecological. I know Jeremy Johnson, who does so much work on Gesper, was saying we have to bring the world with us in our transformation, because if we do not, well, then we're disembodied, right? We don't have a world. So it makes me think also, so there's a few things, and then I think Osho, maybe in his book on maturity, talks about that if he was able to, he'd make two kinds of school. Like when you're a kid, you go to school to learn things, but then he's like, when you're 43, you need to go back to school. He'd send people back to school to learn about God, death, and life. And he's like, we have a real problem today because we don't have an educational period for, like, I like to call them the mid-years. I think we have a crisis where we don't have any thinking about the mid-years between like after 20 and 60, like that 40-year gap, or well, let's say 30 and 60. That 30-year gap is like a wasteland for people, and they don't know what to do with it. And it seems like that is where the consequences of not having the shamanic training is like really pronounced, because then you fall into basically, what will you say, in the unthinking, unconsciousness, like people going around unconscious. I know Sweeney was like, oh my gosh, if we realized how many people were unconscious, we'd like go nuts. Like we'd be terrified, we might fall down and die, as he was saying. And it's almost like the shaman, based on that Osho idea as well, like I'd be curious what you would say about the real consequences of the lack of personal transformation really coming out in those middle years. And obviously it can go on beyond that, but then it's almost like, because of the retirement structure, once you get to 60, you can kind of hide it by consuming or traveling or spending all the money that you've aligned. Although I will say we have this massive that would be it. The friend session they talk about, where nobody has friends anymore. Like the friend session, or elderly people are very alone or lost connections. And I do wonder if that's something about shamanism and friendship go together as well. But the first thing I would ask, one, do you think we need to send everyone back to school at 43, like Osho says, and learn about shamanistic things? And two, is it really kind of almost like we see in society the consequences today of not having this shamanistic thinking, this personal transformation comes out in those middle years? And do you think that's tied? I know Viveki talks about the meaning crisis, nihilism, boredom, all these different things, that these are sort of the very tangible consequences of a degradation in quality of life that's a result of not having more shamanistic thinking?
The percentage of people in the village who are just instinctively or obsessively drawn toward the shamanic practices, they tend to work on it their whole life. But then they have a responsibility to provide something to the village. The purpose of it is not merely to indulge their tendencies, it's to create this complementarity between the esoteric and the exoteric aspects of social life. They're meant to support each other. So what is it that the esoteric practitioners provide to the rest of the village? They provide support and counsel in times of ordeal, whether that's trauma or transformation. They provide instruction and sometimes the generation of ritual and phases. They provide the opportunity to get back in touch, as we've been saying, with the vital currents that underlie our lives. And they also have a special role to play in cultivating elderhood within the village, right? So that crucial period of time, those middle years, those are the years that determine whether a person who now has a formed prefrontal cortex in their early 20s to the time when we expect them to play a wise role in the village, right? They're either living in a way that generates wisdom, so such that we would look at them and go, oh, that's an actual elder. That person has a glint in their eye. That person has lived complex human experience in a personally embodied way so that they can tell us something about it versus just being an old person. So one of the reasons we have a meaning crisis is because we have an eldership crisis. We have plenty of old people. We don't have a lot of elders. And so how to live that period of your life in a way that moves you towards elderhood is essential. And it's a very busy period of life, right? You are called upon to perform social tasks. And for many people, you're also called upon to perform reproduction tasks, right? Having children occupies most people's time there, and going to work occupies the rest. So you have very little internal resources left over, and likely whatever's left over is indulged in particular habits of consumption and play. So one of the things that the esoteric class should be able to do is help to skew the free time and the attitudinal approach of people in those years so that they tend to accrue the internal complexity and multidimensionality that will be needed from them as elders when they pass out of that period of time. Now, I don't know that we need special schooling, but I think ideally you would have systems set up where people can sort of drop out of their life at any point and try to explore additional aspects of what they're doing, most likely with the goal of returning to their life in an enriched and enlivened form.
I think it's an excellent answer. I think it was Leslie Newbegin. He once said that if once you retire, you have nothing to do, you did something wrong. After you retire, it should be the busiest part of your life, precisely because you move into that eldership role. Definitely, I've heard people talk about a mentor crisis, where young people don't have a mentor, the elder crisis, and definitely one of the great calamities of the Western world is seemingly having no role of the elderly population. In fact, it seems like they're kind of, oh, you retired, you don't. Well, that's where the retirement concept is so bad, because now there's no more work for you to do. You go on, go have fun. You worked really hard. You don't have to do anything anymore. And then, that leads to all sorts of trouble. And that doesn't seem to be the right way to go about it. And I'm always very interested in Japan, because I do think that Japan is basically a glimpse into where the West goes. Everyone is going in the Japanese direction. I would have to elaborate on that. I've spoken with Daniel Zaruba on it, but you have demographic crisis, you have meaning crisis, you have kind of, you don't have reproduction, you have all sorts of social issues that arise in that environment. Now, I'm not trying to judge Japan or anything like that, because I also think they have some of the most extraordinary music, movie, storytelling in the entire world. But it is something of note where when you don't know what to do with the elderly, or the elderly are not moving into this shamanic role, if you will, that seems to be very problematic. So there's a few things that come to mind. The first thing is, one, is it possible to have elders have that function if you have an authority crisis, which is where nobody really believes in authority, or no, authority is bad because there's that impulse now, which comes from a fair place. I mean, people feel tricked by the institutions, the government, the White House. They feel tricked by institutions. I do worry, though, if that spills over into people trusting no forms of authority at all. So I'd be curious if you think the elder problem is connected to the authority problem, and how one would go about to, restoring authority is a large cry. You'd have to deal with the legitimization crisis, maybe of a Habermas or something like that. But authority seems important here. And maybe it's also the issue where people will give authority to those of whom they see personal transformation in and want it themselves. There might be something. So I'm curious what you think about the authority issue today. And then second, I know Ivan Illich also talked about the need to have kind of education outside of schooling. One of the things that does give me hope is perhaps that YouTube and these liminal web spaces are an example of where people can access maybe more shamanic educations, maybe more holistic educations, maybe more the kind of wisdom practices that are positive in the way that we are so describing when they are available. Like the likelihood of, say, a single mom at maybe 38 being able to go to a school somewhere while running a job and 3 kids is not realistic, but it's very possible perhaps to listen to 30 minutes here, 20 minutes there. You always kind of, Rita Dove talks about like grasping your time to write lines of poetry or different things like that. And I do think there's a positive thing there with YouTube. And then the last thing, in addition to the authority problem, I also wonder if the loss of elders, and I completely agree with you, I think the mentor, I can speak to my own life. I was fortunate to be able to basically sit on my porch of my grandfather every afternoon and listen to his stories and get his wisdom, his discernment. And then I had some extraordinarily important older gentlemen who I would meet at a diner every Friday for like 10 years, Mr. Dillard, who I would speak to. And that made all the difference in the world, all the difference in the world. And not having those mentors seems very consequential. So I wonder what you would say. So I agree on, I think what Osho is getting at, there's a lot of truth to, although sending people to special schooling may not work, and hopefully having access to something like YouTube or whatever may open some different doors. Of course, YouTube can also get you the ice cream videos. It's so good, so good, so good. Yeah. Which maybe have their place, but it could also be open people's door. But I wonder if the authority problem ties into this, and also the issue where people seem to struggle to have friends, because you seem to need to have a kind of friendship bond with elders, or know what friendship is in order to even have that elder relationship. And if people don't know how to have friends, or they struggle with friendship, you can look at Cicero on friendship, Aristotle on friendship. And then I also think of the topic of leisure, because he would, Bloom and Piper talked about kind of friendship and leisure connected. But anyway, on shamanism, the possibility of eldership with authority and friendship, I'd be curious what you would think in response to that.
Yeah, it has to work with, like you're saying, the moments of a person's life. Right. And I think ideally we would have a different economic system where more people were afforded more moments. That would be ideal and necessary in order for a thriving general village. Osho's coming at it a little bit from the classical Hindu mentality that you move through these specifically formalized phases of life and become religious sort of as your retirement. But I think it's got to be much more flexible and much more adaptable than that. The authority crisis is in many ways justified. I think it's probably in some ways misphrased as an authority crisis. It strikes me as more of a respect crisis and an inability to make human contact with other types of people, right? And so those skills are necessary for friendship. They're also necessary for becoming sort of more than just an ethnocentric reactionary. To become more human in general is dependent upon learning the ability to show up emotionally with a broader range of human types. But in order to get that, you have to, I think what you need to do is have people orient toward eldership with a long run up to that, so that when they get there, they have the attitude and ability to start functioning as elders for people coming up after them. That's sort of what I would propose as a general pro-eldership ethic at the moment, is for people who don't know whether they can do it or not, but start moving in that direction, start trying to identify who the elders are, start trying to enter into relationships of respect and mutual listening. one of the things that you see in a lot of spiritual communities right now is this tension between whether you have a strict vertical hierarchy or whether you move to some sort of egalitarian collective in terms of these spiritual and wisdom communities. And neither one is really satisfying, because if you can't respect differences in the degree of beingness and the degree of insight, then there's really no point in having those communities. There's nowhere for you to move. But if you have a simple traditionalist hierarchy, you have all these possibilities for abuse and actually a very limited capacity for the human beings to derive nourishment from each other in a developmental sense. So what I've been thinking about in that regard for the last couple of years is a richer form of interpersonal communication, right? We have a general idea that we're peers and everybody shares what's going on for them. And there are elements of our existential, ontological, and let's call it subtle energy situation that most of the time we don't hear about from each other. Very often we hear about it from one person who's up on a dais. I'm going to tell you about all the amazing experiences I had, and you're all going to be collectively equal on the floor in front of me. But it would be much better if you could hear from everybody what's going on for them, so that we could consciously and subconsciously get a map of the differential terrain of everyone's experience. So that then we can start to see, like, oh, that's actually the kind of interior that I respect, that I want more of. That person becomes 10% of an authority or 20% of an authority for me because I want to move in that direction. I'm not just being told by someone that I should. I've actually heard from everyone's experience. Nobody is the enforced authority, but there's nonetheless things I respect more than other things that I wish to move toward. And I'm willing then, in a very authentic way, to put myself at stake to start to move in those directions.
That's lovely. So the Hegelian in me is coming out, and I really like this idea. So it's almost like the loss of authority is a good thing because the negation, sublation of it is respect. And authority has a totalitarian tendency to it. And, you know, you go through where when what they're calling an authority crisis might actually be the negation of authority to make possible the sublation of a better form of it in respect. But that, of course, requires the existential anxiety and terror of facing that authority that tempts you to go back to authority. But really, the reason authority is failing is because it's better to fail. That's the space of the negation, sublation into respect, where I do think the point is very good. When you see something awesome, or you see a marvelous performance of Macbeth, you don't sit there and go, on what authority is that good? You sit there and go, that was freaking amazing. So respect is something almost that you can't help but give when you behold it, right? And it's almost like authority is the lame thing that comes in to force you to assent to something to be good if it is not able to show itself as being good. And one cannot help of then, like, when you see something magnificent, wanting to give your life to it or giving some percentage of it. Well, that's very lovely, and that seems to move to, I'll talk a lot about beauty, and, like, you know, when something is beautiful to you, no one has to convince you to be ethical toward it. Nobody has to convince you to treat it with care. You can't help but treat it with care, because beauty in its very attractiveness, which I would align with respect here, tends to change the way the person treats it. It changes the way that you go about coordinating yourself in light of it. So it's funny because there's a way in which, say, authority, ethics, all of these different things are almost coming in to fill what's actually missing, which is the right horizon of the thing, or the thing that presents itself in a manner that makes you feel that it's beautiful and feels like respect. Like, if you want to be like someone, no one has to remind you of the categorical imperative. No one has to remind you of the 10 Commandments. When you say, oh my gosh, that person's amazing, or that is amazing, I want to be like that, you just naturally improv and figure out how to go about it. Now, there is some levels of social and emotional intelligence that goes about knowing how to do that well. But I think this idea on, it's almost like respect, if I dare say there's an emergency, it's more, it just happens when you see grandeur, when you see beauty, then you don't really need authority. And in fact, authority could get in the way of respect forming as such, because when you see something beautiful, they don't have the credentials or they don't have the institutional support. So then you're not allowed to enjoy it. And one could say that perhaps the collapse of authority in institutions actually allows more respect to form and beauty to occur, because the people that can so generate, or the elders that are there, are going to be able to be seen per se, or they'll be able to interact without being blocked. So I really like that. And I also agree, I think OSHA says something like 14 to 16 is young sexual, 16 to 20, like there's different stages and different things. And what I hear you describing, which I like, is kind of the idea that if you want someone to be an elder, the seed has to be planted when they're young. So then as they get older, it sprouts. But if you don't plant the seed, say, till they're 40, well, then it may not sprout till they're 80, right? So there has to be some sort of conditioning so that it comes up. And I think also what you're saying on these kind of vertical structures perhaps getting in the way of all that, because when you have a vertical structure, they may create a rubric that says you only plant the seed when people are 40. And if it's wrong, well, they control the survey to make sure the metrics are always in their favor, so they never have to admit it. And of course, you never see the beauty and respect that would have formed if the system wasn't there. So you can never know what you're missing out because of the presence of that vertical system. So it always becomes, I call it an indestructible map. It always becomes something that has a map for understanding the world that cannot be falsified simply because it determines the metrics of falsification. It determines the metrics of which would challenge it. So on the notion of the shaman, I also like what you were saying on 10% here, 20% there, 30 respect there, and kind of giving yourself over to that things to become those different things. What would be, do you think, some of the areas that the shaman would showcase or show that would garner said respect or show such beauty that people would like to be like, and what would those areas be? So, for example, would it be judgment, the ability to make quality judgments in complex situations? Would it be the ability to know how to, say, use sexual energy in a productive way? Would it be the ability to know how to make and garner friends? Maybe what I would ask, or what are some of the particular areas that a shaman might concentrate on that would garner said respect, or that people would see as beautiful, or that you think are particularly useful, or that you have seen people are interested in cultivating in their own lives, that has led to some personal transformations?
I think one of the things that's going to be, assuming society doesn't collapse, increasingly of interest to people is, how do you actually have a good time, right? How do you really appreciate the beauty of beautiful things? How do you really take enjoyment in your pleasures? How do you actually act on your ethics and not just have your ethics? That kind of thing, right? So those are, there are sets of positive qualities that we look to in our lives as if they're going to give meaning to our lives. And a lot of people have those things and yet don't feel that sense of meaning. So a person who both is able to draw nourishment from those positive experiences and communicate in a plausible manner about practices that would help other people do that, that becomes a very attractive thing. I think the classic esoteric practice or esoteric authority comes from transformation and comes from suffering, right? Are there ways to be with your suffering that allow you to mature and not merely suffer? And are there ways to move through unrest, transformations in your life, ambiguity, and things like that in a way that is more like a surfer, less like a capsized boat? That's going to be very important as our society becomes very complex, potentially unstable, potentially reaching the limit of the kind of civilizational machinery we've been using for some time, and also inundated by a world of uncertain agencies and hyper simulation of information sources. So we're entering a kind of extreme ambiguity and peculiarity moment in history. So people who can exhibit pleasure, exhibit existential contentment, exhibit balance under the conditions of hyperambiguity, I think that's going to be a very attractive thing. And that's a set of skills people will want to be able to access and get better at, as well as simply being able to be more in their body and be more in their nature as well. Like the more we see ecological accumulation of instability, the more we think we need a better relationship with nature. But that's not just recycling your bottles and cans. It's not just tithing some money when you buy a mocha to go to the indigenous problematics of the Amazon. It's some transformation in the way we actually are with the rest of the organisms on the planet. So there's an ancient shamanic set of capacities involved in that. Of course, the altered state experience is going to play a significant role, whether it's meditation, whether it's trance states, whether it's psychedelics. We're going to look to people who have expertise in those areas to help us get safely in and out of those intense meaning-making opportunities. And just the general notion of ongoing development, right? So I come with a background from the integral community and a number of these other related developmental cognitive models. But everybody understands that they could be smarter, they could be more solid, they could be good, they could be a more good person, they could be better at decision making, they could be better at bearing the uncertainties of their lives, right? There's a vertical developmental organic future that's not imposed, but which is available to people to unfold in their own lives. And I think pretty much everybody wants that. So wherever they see somebody who's had whatever little bit of success in that area and can speak to that, I think that's going to end up being very attractive. Although on the whole, if we think, how are we going to re-script the global village, you end up needing more than that. You need some social allure and status around these that might need to have some kind of artificial production, as it may have in ancient societies. Nietzsche talked a lot about shamans without using that terminology. But one of the things he said is, how do you get a contemplative person in a barbaric culture? He's like, they have to do things that freak the other people out, because the other people are organizing around the muscular and emotional force of their intensity. And they're not going to give you the time to pay attention to subtle things unless you're meditating in the graveyard, unless you come back with a bone through your nose or something that causes other people to give you some kind of social space where you can cultivate the authority you're trying to work on.
That was outstanding. And on that last point, I think the problem of scale, as I like to call it, like as you move up the scale, that's like the $1 million problem. Because it's one thing, like I think, like, so for example, it's one thing to talk about how do you personally transform, say, people in your immediacy or your neighborhood who want to transform, who are open to it, versus how do you transform 8 billion people, 7 billion people who may not want to transform and who don't read any philosophy at all or don't care about the ideas. There's this $1 million question of that. And as you move up the scale, that is where everything becomes very complex, because arguably, if we use the game A, game B language, which I know people critique, but it can be useful as conceptual framework, game A arguably figured out how to solve the scale problem. They did it through a Washington consensus. You could talk about, I know neoliberal is also a critique term, capitalism, so on and so forth. But if you grant those phrases, it dealt with the problem of scale, but with unintended consequences, right? So you're saying, well, that's not going to work. Well, then there's this problem of scale. And then you could say, well, you can't scale it. It has to be decentralized. Well, that's where the whole conversation is. So I think that's an extremely important conversation because it gets into things like economic systems. And it actually does remind me something Osha said, but I'll pause on that because I want to focus for a moment on what you just said about how have a good time, like how to have a good time. I really, really think that's a super big deal. It makes me think of when Joseph, and I know Mr. Limberg at the store talks about Joseph Piper's book on leisure. And leisure, which is always heard today to mean inactivity or idleness, right? Like you're sitting around bored. You know, Piper's like, no, that has nothing to do with leisure. And in fact, that's the opposite of leisure. Leisure is a state of the terms he used is a festival. It's like a celebratory, like life is always celebratory. Osha talks about that as well. And I think one of the Dalai Lamas also said that societies needed to have more festivals. We need to, like, one of the reasons society sucks is because we don't really have festivals anymore, and holidays are very commercialized. And those are reminders of the useless, which is actually the useless is where the fully human comes out, because it's an end in of itself, right? There's also people like, there's a great thinker on the educational issue. He wrote a book called The Treason of the Intellectual Benda, which I had a wonderful talk with on Joshua Hansen. And he said that colleges had they basically forsaken their duty which is that they only teach useful subjects now, not they don't teach useless subjects now, which means they only teach things that can get you a job, that can make you part of the economic system, and not the useless, which is actually the fully human. And what is useless is also what cannot be institutionally captured, precisely because it is useless. Well, you know what's useless is ultimately like the festival, the celebratory spirit, the ability to have a good time. Having a good time is not being useful, it's doing something useless, because that's the very celebration of life. And we don't have, for Julian Benda, we don't have education of the useless anymore. For Joseph Piper, we don't teach leisure, which is that celebratory life. And Joseph Piper also notes that, in Aristotle's like, what are we going to do with our leisure? That's like the $1 million question. And if we don't know how to do that, we're just going to be controlled by institutions, the economy. And then, of course, when you have free time, that means you're what? Useless. And useless equals bad. So then people feel bad not to work. So then they go back to a job they hate, that they hate being at. And when they're off of it, they feel like they're not productive. And so they just, might have a meaning crisis or something like that, right? So the defense of the useless space, which of course is hard to use now because it sounds useless, but the end in of itself space is basically the only way to save civilization. For a Benda, for a Piper. You can also say, I guess, Alan Bloom at the end of the Closing the American Mind, he warns that education was no longer teaching the art of leisure. Therefore, he actually says, without that, you can't have friendship. Without like the philosophical pursuit of the fully human, you can't have friendship. You can't have the human, and everything will be institutionally captured. And then, of course, if it's institutionally captured, that means whatever the institutions want to do with the environment is what you're going to do with the environment, because you have no way to defend it. And I like also this have a good time, because when you said it, it's funny, good stood out to me. It means pleasurable, but also like ethical, like good time. Like it's funny there, because what Piper is showing is that the festival is a symbol of the ethically good in the pleasurable. Like this is the problem. We've also separated the ethical from the pleasurable. But Bloom, Benda, Aristotle, all these people would say, well, once you separate the good from the ethical, and the good also being the fully human and the pleasurable, you're screwed, because, the ethical then becomes the dead. The ethical becomes the not being an automaton, basically. So I'd be curious, like, one, would you say that the shaman is indeed in the business of creating those spaces of leisure, creating the space of knowing how to be useless and see that as an accomplishment of humanity? And would you say the shaman is in the business of the festive? And then I guess it would mean, is precisely the inability to have a good time, then that would be kind of the evidence of the need of the shaman. And I really like how you're approaching that as being something that would convince people to engage in shamanic activities. Because don't you like to have a good time, or do you enjoy being bored?
Yeah, I think there's a strong connection anciently, and there's a future for the shamanic connection to the festive. Although we have to remember that it's also connected to the ordeal, but also that the ordeal can be festive, right? Yes. That there are ways of personally and collectively enjoying agonies of certain kinds when they're constrained by the right sorts of psychotechnologies. The creation of sacred space, which is both a context and a mode of participation, that's necessary for ritual, but it's also necessary for having an opening, having a clearing of possibilities, which is available to us in something analogous to leisure, right? We have to be able to, especially in an increasingly complex world situation where we don't necessarily know how to feel our way toward the right decisions and outcomes, we have to be increasingly available to unknown possibilities of how to manage and reorganize the system that we're in. And we're not going to find those by staying plugged into particular habit sets within that system. So we have to have people who specialize in tracking a greater possibility set, and we have to have everybody enter that space periodically. So both for enjoyment and for the ability to find different pathways forward in their own lives and in our collective life. There's certain kinds of, let's say, tactical methodologies that help with that, right? There's certain things. The people in the positive psychology movement are very aligned with some of the ancient Buddhist practices, which is to say, you can train your brain to be better at positive experiences of various kinds, because we have an evolutionary slant towards negative experience because that serves a survival imperative. But we can intentionally add to that by saying, when something feels amazing, how amazing is it? Are you capable of extending that feeling, that neurochemistry? Are you capable of enriching it? Are you capable of spreading it to more areas of your nervous system? Yes, there are means of doing this. So we can actually become better at taking the pleasures of things. And one of the dangers of a flattened, empty, dystopic world is you get all the things you want and you don't enjoy any of them. You just become Nietzsche's last man in the sense of having no real pleasure even in the things that give you pleasure. And I think one of the classic ways that the shaman has to take a stand culturally for that open space is not just to conceptualize it as a party, but to conceptualize it as the positive presence of the strange, right? That the shaman is a weirdo in some sense. They're standing for possibilities that are normally filtered out of everyday behavior. And that's one of the reasons I think our festivals tend to collapse. If we go to family Christmas every year and we do it in the same reasonable way, we get the same incomplete results. And when the shaman comes and they go, you know what, let's have the Christmas tree upside down and painted purple. And everybody goes, no, that's not what we do at Christmas. You're like, okay, but if you want it to be revitalizing, it's going to have to be weird. You can't get the effect you want by constraining yourself to the conventional pattern. That's just not really an option.
That's excellent. It makes me think. Walker Percy, at the beginning of his essay collection, maybe the Delta Factor, he says something like, "Why is it that people tend to be happiest when there's a big hurricane coming? Why is it that people tend to be happiest when they're most miserable or something gets destroyed?" And then he references, I guess Durkheim in his book Suicide. He makes the point that first world nations have higher suicide rates than other nations, right? You would think where things are happier, that you wouldn't have so many different problems. And then people like Freud is going to talk about how a lot of psychoanalysis is needed in first world nations, which is all very strange, right? But for Walker Percy's point, what basically it's kind of suggesting is that if you don't have that weirdness, if you don't have that flipping things up to revitalize, then you're still going to be looking for the new, but how that's going to manifest is in the destructive. Then you're excited about hurricanes because hurricanes change things up. Then you're looking for like destruction because destruction changes things up. And that distrato comes up. If you don't have the shaman kind of coming in and saying, let's turn over the Christmas tree, then the way that manifests is actually looking forward to the hurricane, looking forward to something bad happen, or I guess you could talk about scapegoats, the other, who you can then attack because the other will spice it up. The bad guy will spice it up. And so it's interesting to think that if we don't own practices of spicing it up, then it's still going to manifest, and it's going to manifest in a very destructive way, because the way that it's almost like, there's always this interesting tension between like creativity. To create is to destroy, and to the destroy is to create. It seems like it's a kind of ordering thing. It's almost like what the shaman does is he comes in and creates the change so that, destroy the regular, so that it actually revitalizes in a way. Or else what's going to happen is destruction will create the revitalization, but it does it by losing what was there, or it's the hurricane that kind of comes up. So it seems like that it can manifest in those ways.
Yeah, the figure of Shiva in the Hindu tradition sort of stands for a disruptive transformer. And there are different ways for that disruptive transformation to occur. It can be ruin, or it can be revitalization. And a lot of that depends on the amount of subtlety and skill that's brought to it. Because if you can't get engagement and intensity and novelty in a kind of, let's call it domesticated fashion, in a safe and subtle fashion of some kind, then, like you're saying, you're going to instinctively start to pursue it in a nihilistic and catastrophic fashion. You start to pray for the destruction. Even if what you think you're doing is warding it off, you're still fixated on some kind of apocalyptic intensity. And one of the things that I've noticed in the sort of biography, the generic biography of the shamanic character, is that early on, they're often driven towards very wild, very abnormal states. But if that doesn't destroy them, they tend to gain a more sophisticated self-regulatory capacity to access those things in subtler fashions, right? There's a big difference between to use somewhat of a crude example, a person who might like a little bit of, a hand on their throat or a little bit of pressure, right? There's a big difference between that and dying of autoerotic asphyxiation or actually being choked, right? And we tend to overshoot the mark because we don't have the self-regulatory capacity and the subtlety to realize that what we wanted was a revitalizing threshold experience. And as the shamanic types of people get more sophisticated and more mature, they should be able to help more people get the vitalizing thresholds without overshooting that into a self-destructive longing for intensity.
I think that's right. It makes me think, it's almost like the youth, you almost need those, the people talk about initiations, rituals, and different things. You almost need those rituals when you're younger, where you taste destruction and difficulty in different things, but not at large enough of a scale where it's apocalyptic, but where you can see, can destruction actually revitalize? And when you're younger, you say, yeah, it can, but maybe not as much as I want, or maybe I shouldn't rely on this. So for example, like if you do, we were talking about the importance of, say, difficulty or things like that, right? Like when you're younger, if you do wrestling or long distance running or different things like that, you learn the kind of joy that can happen, part of grit and part of difficulty. And that's a revelation. That's very important, which maybe when you're older, you're not going to be able to do long distance running or wrestling as much, so you can learn it that way. So one, you get that category in your mind where grit and joy can go together, when before then you might think they don't go together. So that's an important revelation. And the other thing is you also kind of learn, well, there's a certain, like, you kind of get out the destroy. You experience the pleasures that come from aggression, but you also experience the limits of those pleasures that come from aggression, right? And by experiencing that young, when, say, it's on a wrestling mat, or it's, say, putting up a barn or stuff like that, then when you get older, you've tried that. So you don't have this kind of wondering in your head, oh, maybe I should just let loose, or I should just let go or do something crazy. When of course you're older, if you do that, you're not going to be having your elder role, like we said earlier, and the consequences can be much, much more dire. Because it's almost like there's always the problem, ideas are not experiences. Where if I tell you, for example, that it's important not to let your aggression control you, you can know that, but until you actually experience it, you can always not really get it. So it's kind of like the importance of creating spaces where people are young and the stakes are lower, to where they can experience it and then remember that and know that that is not the way. So that then as they get older, they actually move in the direction of, say, revitalizing through creation versus destruction, because they've already had the experiences when they were younger of how destruction or just straight aggression without a creative element or tactfulness or skill is not the way, or there are certain limitations to it. So if you don't have those initiation processes or those ways for younger people to have those experiences, then it's almost like it's still lurking there as they get older. And then it can come out in destructive ways. Or another way to put it, I think, on your point, if when they're younger, they don't start to sense the importance of wisdom or have the seeds of wisdom, then why would they go for it when they were 40? Or why would it bloom when they were 40? It's not there to kind of bloom. So likewise, it's almost like when it's younger, I can definitely say that doing a lot of physical activity or aggression or places where anger can come out when you were younger was very important, because that was actually the planting of the seed to move in a more creative destruction for revitalization, as opposed to a destructive place of revitalization. And the other reason why that's important, and I'll give it back to you, is in that destructive context, you're kind of externally motivated versus internally motivated, because you need the place where you can engage in that aggression, right? Like the wrestling mat, or other people, or things like that. You need a certain condition. Well, that's inherently limiting, right? So that's one reason where you learn, oh, I have to figure out how to be internally motivated and not be destructive, though, because if I'm destructive, say, off the wrestling mat, my neighbor may not talk to me anymore. And also that goes to show you of the need. It also does show you that you have that energy if you could only sort of cultivate it, but you start moving in an intrinsic motivation direction. And it does seem to me, and then I'll give it to you, that a lot of the question of how to have a good time is tied to the ability to be intrinsically motivated as opposed to extrinsically motivated. And a way I think of intrinsic motivation is that it's a diluted form of a flow state, where a lot of people, I know Vivek and different people, and the Mikhail Cheslov, it's a great book he wrote on creativity too. It's a great book. He invented the flow state. And there's a lot of talk on the flow state being kind of the fittedness in reality and how things operated. You could talk about the beatific vision of a Dante, Aristotle, and definitely, and I know D.C. Sindler talks about this, on how the classical notion of freedom is found more so in like a flow state way of life, as opposed to eating chocolate whenever you want. It's found in like intrinsic motivation seems to be a distilled or diluted form of that flow state into your everydayness. And it would seem like the ability to move into intrinsic motivation has something to do with having a good time, which would then be creative versus destructive. And then all of that then would suggest the need for, say, rituals or practices when kids are younger to experience the limitations of revitalization through destruction and aggression. So as they get older, they may move in a direction that looks for revitalization through the weirdness, through the shamanic, through the kind of spinning it up, or else it's going to manifest in the form of waiting for a hurricane.
I think one of the important roles of the shaman, or whatever we end up wanting to call them, is to provide the integration of wild or undomesticated experienced intensities of various kinds into the structure of village life, right? So we're facing two dangers. One danger is an increasingly impoverished, self-calming, repetitive, unsatisfying form of social existence, or self-destructive and other destructive intensities of various kinds. So you need people and rituals and habits and customs to focus on mediating between those two, affirming the intensities, but then critically integrating and assimilating them into the tolerable domain of the village. That's one of the main things the shaman also has to be good at. So when there are altered states or drug experiences, right, one of the main things is not that you had the experience, but can you actually derive anything useful from it? Can it be of help to you? How do you integrate that into your life? Just like if you behold the face of God, does that break your mind, or is that something that can improve your life? So the art of integration and assimilation is one of the main specialty areas, I think, of the shamanic going forward. And that fits very closely to what you were saying about the role of these intensities in children, because it's yes, very important for them to have the opportunity to undergo intensities, but B, they require a whole supportive system to help them make sense of that, right? There has to be, I think, at the very least, actual curiosity and emotional stability on the part of people who are going to talk them through what that intensity was like after the fact, so that they find that intensity to be acceptable and interesting and worth thinking about, so it can actually play a role going forward and not just be a wild thing that passively afflicted them one time. Yeah, I could go into some other areas, but I think that's a key area is, how do we set up the conditions for the assimilation and integration of intensities as a shamanic specialty?
Oh, I love that. It makes me think, so if people say, for example, so there's a few things. One, like if you do something that, like if you read philosophy and you're not going to get a philosophy PhD, people think you're crazy and you're wasting your time, right? Like if you're having pursuits of, say, certain skills or abilities to have a good time in your leisure, then the village, the community is like, that's useless, right? So if you don't have a social condition that has a category of leisure, that means the village can't fit that alternative state of using your time into its way of thinking, and therefore it others it and pushes it out. And if Piper and all these people are correct that without leisure, civilization is dead, you're not going to have friendship, and you're all going to just be you're all going to be captured by the system in a Deleuzian sense, well, then the village not being able to make space for the category of leisure and the useless is destroying itself. It may be protesting the system all that it likes. It may be saying, oh, this is bad. But as it alienates that alternative use of free time, and of course that would apply to alternative states of, say, mysticism, psychedelics, and different things, then you're literally alienating the categories necessary to resist that capture that you are protesting. So I think that's a very astute observation. I definitely think, too, what you're saying about like alternative states and then having elders that can help you integrate them, that's such a big deal, because it's very similar to how people say passion for reading Hegel or philosophy or different things increases once they find other people to talk about it with. Like it is very, very difficult to say if you want to engage in shaman practices, the shaman practices, or you could say metamodern, game B, Hegel, like all these different things. Like if you don't have other people to help you integrate with it, it's incredibly difficult to do. And what's really nice is when you have an elder who really knows the material or has familiar, a lot of experience with psychedelics or these alternative states that can then help you integrate with it. Like, so an example is we see what mystical experience or mysticism can do to communities without mediation. It can rip it apart because they don't have the ability to integrate with it. I think a good example can be American Pentecostalism, which was the fastest growing religious movement in America for a very, very long time, has unfortunately, in my opinion, fallen into basically fascism, extremism, and different things because they had this unleashing of the Holy Spirit, the mystical, the unbound, the anti-religious, the anti-institution, but then without having the elders to help people integrate with that kind of power, it has fallen into conspiratorial thinking. It is magical thinking in general, and it is completely sort of devolved. And so I think Pentecostalism in America is a strong case study of what you're warning about. I mean, we've seen the collapse of what happens when you unleash great power to people, but not the ability to integrate it. Likewise, if you're, say, going through wrestling and you're getting the crap beat out of you every single day, and you're like, what's the point of it? Well, if you have an elder that can say, well, the point of it is that's actually going to help you when you're in the tough times to see through and get the fruit of it, that's going to help you see it through. It is very difficult to be I guess trans-rational. It's very bound to not have your rationality screw you if you don't have elders that can help you see beyond your rationality at a horizon that's not there. And so you almost get bound by your own thinking to give up on the things that you need to be fully alive. So that role of integration by the elder, I think, is just extremely important.
I think one of the things that an elder or even just a person who we think lived a good life has to show us, well, two things. One is, did you really follow your prompts and did you really enjoy your enjoyments? Then also, were you able to extend your intention over longer ranges of time, which is crucial, right? So that classic esoteric practices involve modifications of perception in the sense of, how do I select and more intensely receive the salience of the things I'm interested in rather than squandering a lot of my attention on things I'm not interested in? And how do I build up what they used to call the will? How do I build up some capacity to reorder myself and constrain myself to a rule, which I can then use to enforce a discipline in the service of what I actually want to do? So if I can't see the prompts that feel really personal to me, if I can't enjoy the experiences I come across, and I can't impose some kind of rule on myself that corresponds specifically to my idiosyncratic kinds of prompts and enjoyments, then I can't possibly live a life that's going to be pleasurable and fulfilling to me personally. But that's also the kind of life that I have to live in order to become a complex representative of the human condition who can then provide the eldership service to the rest of the community.
I really like that. And I like what you're saying about attention in the same way that I'm a big fan of this idea of the negation sublation of authority being respect. That's quite nice. I think it's very important. There's a lot of emphasis on intention. I think the negation sublation of intention is attention. I think the movement, Anscombe talks about intention. I'm a big, Simone Weil has a big on attention. And I think attention is way more important than intention, because you can have all the intention you want, but if you're not able to keep attention, then it's not going to change your life. And the ability to cultivate attention, especially if we allude to Mr. Stein's work on screens taking over, destroying focus, destroying the ability to think straight, that is, well, actually, there's a real risk in which if people don't realize the name of the game is attention, then as they lose the ability to have attention, they may not notice it because they're like, but I still have intention. I still intend to do things. I still intend the good. And so that functions as a kind of counterfeit to keep you from seeing the loss of the ability to have attention, which I think it is very, I don't think spiritual transformation is a result of intention. I think it's it is a consequence of attention. And, Simone Weil is so good on that. Grace and Gravity. She in general is actually a very good model and case study of a lot of ways to live. She's very interesting. And the notion, and then it's also interesting because attention gets tied to loves. Like we tend to pay attention to what we love. And there's a lovely, James K. Smith has a nice little phrase where he says, you are what you love. And what he means by that is we tend to form habits relative to what we love. Like whatever we love, which tends to be relative to our environments, like our environments work on our loves. And that also speaks to Zach Stein, right? With the screen working on our loves and what we want. Well, then what we love tends to shape how we use our time, which then forms our habits. So you are what you love, right? So this would also say that the ability to have attention, which seems to be tied to the ability to will, is also the ability to have control over what we love and what we focus on, and therefore what habits we form, and therefore what people we are. So if we don't have the ability to cultivate attention, then what we love will probably be quite random. It will probably be controlled by other things, and then it will be gone. So in a world, it would seem to me, in a world where basically the screen and the system, if we allude to Mr. Stein's work, where everything is basically working to destroy your attention or to steal your attention, then having a shaman class, elders, that actually preserve attention and cultivate attention are going to be utterly necessary, because that attention will be destroyed. And then worse yet, and a kind of Kierkegaardian despair, the man in despair doesn't know they're in despair kind of thing. If you lose attention, but you still have intention, you also may not notice what you've lost because you think you still have intention. So there's a kind of bait and switch, and you don't even notice it occurred. So it would seem like, to what you're saying, that the shaman in cultivating those spaces of cultivating attention become utterly necessary, considering the kind of war that Zach Stein in his piece was talking about that we have to deal with in an attention economy. That's what's kind of funny. We're in an attention economy where everyone's taking our attention, and yet to even know what attention is, you'd have to have it. Like, I'm afraid that we think of attention, we see that word and it's a simile for intention, so we don't even know what we've lost, when really it's a kind of regaining the memory of what it would mean to have attention.
A huge percentage of classical esoteric practices are involved in trying to increase your faculty of attention, because we're really only content with our lives when we have more attention than we need for our current circumstances and tasks. Right? So there are various ways to do that, right? There's all kinds of meditative and concentration exercises where you're going to intentionally attend for longer or more precise periods of time. There are the kinds of practices where you try to bring multiple forms of attention together, which are very interesting. They correspond to the integration model, but they're also very much tied in with my fondness for Gurdjieff's work and his interest in generating extra attention by bringing somatic and affective and cognitive attention together to create surpluses of various kinds. But I think there's also this sense in which we miss the richness of the world if we don't make a point of staying with things, right? So to come to Zach Stein's point about screens, one of the greatest dangers of screens is when you see something lovely in the world, when you encounter beauty, you immediately think, oh, I'd better capture this with a digital device so that it can be shared to someone else. Right? So you spend an extra minute or two putting it in this device. If you'd spent that extra minute or two perceiving your perception, staying with it more intensely, you would have a richer experience of the world. You would enjoy your enjoyment more. And the kind of blending between yourself and the world that we end up calling your degree of being would be increased over time. It's also an element of the pleasure thing is there as well, right? We build a kind of capitalist economy that's set to cause you to trip past what you're doing, right? You have a piece of chocolate, you eat it, and it's designed to make you want another one. It's not designed to satiate you. To satiate you, to really take enjoyment in the thing you're enjoying, you have to purposefully stay with it. You have to attend more intensely. Otherwise, you're not going to end up experiencing any of your experiences, enjoying any of your pleasures, or building up this additional attentional capacity that's going to be especially important in a world that's competing to feed on your attention now.
I think that's marvelous. I worked as a photographer for a long time, and maybe in the same way that was a childhood ritual that kind of helped me out. Then as I got older, I was kind of like, what the frick? People are spending so much time taking pictures at being at a party. They're not even at the party. Like, we've turned life into a bunch of Pokemon that we're going to catch all of our moments, put them on our phone, and then we never even look at the photographs. People don't even print pictures to frame anymore. They just put them in their phone, and who knows why. And there's this kind of nervousness of, oh my gosh. Because it's also a signaling, because if you're at a birthday party and you're not constantly taking pictures, you're like, what if people think that means I don't enjoy being here? So I've got to constantly show people I want to be here by taking pictures of it, which means I'm not fully here. And that all is contributing to, it's not the same as standing reserve in Heidegger, but it kind of is too, because you're capturing all these pictures to be a potential power, like that you can use when you're interacting with somebody and you're like, hey, look, I was at the birthday party. So it's like an energy that you can use to lubricate your social reactions one day. So it definitely, to me, no, people are so busy taking pictures at parties that they're not at parties. And I really like this emphasis on the staying with, because I think it speaks to boredom, the crisis of boredom as being the loss of attention. Because boredom is not where you have nothing to do. It's where you don't see significance in what you could do. You always have something you could do. You could always read a book. You could always take a walk. You could always learn to breathe better. Maybe some Alexander methods or something like that, right? So it's never the case that a human being literally has nothing to do. Boredom is the state in which you don't see significance in what you could do. So boredom is when you're trying to get out of. You're trying to get out of this state where you have nothing to do because you have not cultivated the ability to give yourself something to do just by being yourself. So boredom is kind of the opposite of attention in that way, where attention is how to stay with, where boredom is how to get away from. And if you have a culture of boredom, that means that by definition would mean you have a society of people that cannot stay with, right? And I definitely don't think that it helps, because I was going to comment earlier, like we have all of this thinking that kind of locates truth elsewhere, right? Like truth is not here, it's elsewhere. So, I know Brendan in his book on emergentism talks about the part in the whole problem, reductionism, where truth is found in the atom, the smallest part, right? So truth isn't here. This is all an illusion. The truth is the atom. So unless we get to the truth, and the true is the good, so none of this is good either. So you better not have pleasure in it. And you should actually be bored in it because it's not true. And you want to get out of this and get to the smallest part. So first off, we have a metaphysic that a way of viewing the world that makes it to where this is not the truth. It's the smallest parts, which you never observe. So you can't even access the truth. So I definitely think reductionism is part of the problem. Well, once you get out of that, and you have this idea that all levels of reality are equally real in a kind of Wolfgang Smith sense with vertical causation. I know Viveki talked about that as well. Well, now this is true. Okay, so there's possibility of having good there, and therefore it's worth having attention on. But then the next step is there's something dangerous about a stable state, where if this is all there is, well, then there can be a boredom too, because it's finished. We need to feel like we need to feel like we're not just paying attention to something that's finished. We need to feel like we're paying attention to something that's alive. And that's where I think like your metaphysics of adjacency is useful, because there's always that 1% that keeps you from having the completeness. So something is alive. And so if there's something alive, then there's a reason to cultivate attention so that you can participate in that aliveness. And then obviously with Viveki, with the Neoplatonism, if there's also this kind of idea that the forms of reality are actively cultivated in the moment by one's interaction, their mode with it, then attention is part of the formulation of the forms that are formulating reality. And so if you get out of reality to get to something, you're going to the place where nothing is being formulated. You're going to the place where there is nothing to form. And so it also speaks to me where by having all of these kind of metaphysical or scientific mistakes, that also gets us in a mindset of getting away from either getting to the smallest parts because that's where the truth is, or getting away from our subjectivity because truth is found in the objectivity, getting it, this is all complete, so there's no reason to think about it. Like there's so many kind of zeitgeists that are working against the formation of attention that then it's so easy to fall in intention, which is intention is getting to. I intend to become like we talk about becoming a CEO. How do you have we don't talk about attention as a CEO. We talk about intending to get status, intending to get somewhere. So we have an entire socioeconomic structure, metaphysical, scientific structure that's all in the mindset of getting to, as opposed to staying with, intention versus attention. And all of that seems to be speaking to the meaning crisis. And then all of that manifests into the meta crisis. And then you just have a people that aren't able to be with. And then if people can't be with, why would you want to be with them? And then people can't be with one another. And then we don't have friends. So we need to have friends. And that would be, attention would go a long way to helping with the friendship. So it's just interesting to me how these things on all these different levels seem to work on one another.
Yeah, one of the things I often contemplate are what are the colloquial experiences that could have been the source of spiritualities and dharmas over the last several hundreds of thousands of years for human beings, right? And there's some very basic kinds of experiences. One is, hey, that tingles. Like a huge amount of spirituality comes out of just that simple experience. And a huge amount of it comes out of feeling bored, right? The development of internal tools and psychotechnologies are largely a response to the feeling of the insufficiency of our attentional field, right? If you're very often the shaman, I mean, Freud sort of thought of shamanic characters as being psychologically deficient, but studies on actual shamanic cultures in Mircea Eliade's early work in the early part of the 20th century on shamanism found they were very often the most cognitively and socially developed characters in the village. They were post-conventional in some sense. So in regular interactions with other people, there was often an insufficient amount of stimulation or interest for them. So then they could constructively deal with that boredom by coming up with additional attentional tasks to perform. Maybe I will track the whole sensational structure of my body at the same time that I'm having this conversation. Maybe I will be focused on the imaginal glamour of the other person in addition to their statements. Maybe I will be remembering the experience of ultimate value while we're having this conversation. So there's a huge field of dharmic practices that are essentially additional attention skill work for people who would otherwise be bored in the process of conventional encounters. And one of the things I think that's essential in that is preferencing. Like there's a real value to doing the grit and grunt work of staying present with things that are boring and uncomfortable. That's extremely important. But also privileging and highlighting the things that actually are lovely and meaningful and interesting is essentially important as well. Right? One huge source of the meaning crisis is simply that we're not attending often enough or long enough to the things we find meaningful. There are meaningful things, but how much of the share of our time are we devoting to experiencing the meaningfulness of those things? In most spiritual traditions, there's this notion of what the Sanskrit word is darshan, where you go to glimpse, you go to have a sighting of a sacred mountain or the aura of a saint or something like that. You go to behold the additional radiance that we're capable of imaginally perceiving. But if you take a picture of that instead, if you don't give yourself the largely cellular, in a way, right, a physiological response, let yourself assimilate that experience, stay with it. You've gone there because it's neat. There's something about that neatness you want to take into yourself. But if you just acknowledge it as neat and go back to a social or technological mode of response, then you end up malnourished, even though the food is present. So I think a lot of us are not actively privileging the things we find meaningful in our perceptual fields and then committing our extra attentional resources to stay with those long enough that we assimilate the experience of meaningfulness and then can viscerally count upon a world that strikes us as meaningful.
Excellent. I think one, why the cultivation of skill and forms of attention, et cetera, so forth, are so necessary, because there is no such thing as a good thing that not treated with the right skill or to the right proportion doesn't become a terrible thing, right? A song that you love, if you had to listen to nonstop for 72 hours, might become hell, right? Or cake, which you might enjoy, suddenly may not. The things, arguably the only things that are not exhaustible, that you would always want more of, are modes like beauty, truth, and goodness, like the three infinites. One of the reasons they are the infinites is because no matter how much beauty you get, you can always want more truth, goodness, precisely because the manifestations of it vary, right? Well, those are matters of attention. Like those are matters of having the attention to cultivate and attending to reality in a manner that it can disclose yourself according to beauty, truth, and goodness, right? But those are things you cannot intend. Because if I intend for something to be beautiful, it goes away. Like when you, like C.S. Lewis says, when you intend to have a good conversation, you don't. Like there are these things that have to be secondary. They have to just happen when they happen. They have to disclose themselves in their own way. Well, attention is the mode where that's even possible, Without attention, none of that kind of disclosure is possible. And so the very fact that good things at a certain point become bad mean there's a certain skill of proportion, a certain discernment of how much you need and not. And if we don't have those skills, we're in trouble. The other thing you were talking about boredom, it would seem the response to boredom is a big deal. I think it was Pascal who said something like all the world's trouble can be summed up in the fact that man cannot sit alone in a room for 3 minutes. It was either Pascal or Kierkegaard. And there seems to be two ways to respond to boredom, generally. It's always dangerous to say there's only two ways, but if you grant me, is the fleeing from boredom, which is seemingly running from, which is versus the facing. I am bored. What kind of being must I be to get bored? Why am I bored? You know, you start inquiring into it. You become mystified by it. And then if you're mystified by it and you sit with it, suddenly the boredom can be negated, sublated into the condition of attention, right? And the same way that the death of authority can be negated, sublated into respect. Likewise, you see here where boredom suddenly becomes a gift because it comes to the space of, say, daydreaming. It becomes the space of freedom because you are useless in the leisure sense. And that's great because that means you're not captured by the system, right? And if you don't learn to be with boredom until it is negated, sublated into a state of attention and celebration, as Piper and them are saying, that there's only one thing to do. You have to run to it. By definition, you must run from boredom to something that is systematized, institutionalized, or provided by the system or the other. Well, now you're vulnerable to capture. The inability to overcome boredom into attention must make you vulnerable to capture in the Deleuzian sense. So if you have a society that cannot deal with boredom, it cannot deal with the meaning crisis. It cannot deal with the meta crisis. It cannot deal with game A, because by definition, it will have to defer to game A in its very inability to cultivate attention. So to me, this is at the ground zero of the entire problem. And it is very interesting to think that basically ground zero of the entire meaning crisis is being alone in a room. And we just don't think that way. But on the issue of leisure, intrinsic motivation, Kierkegaard, Pascal, the Shaman, everything you're saying, ground zero to the meaning crisis is being alone in a room. And if you cannot be alone in the room and negate it, sublated into a celebration and festival, then friendship will suffer, leisure will suffer, and the only options you will have will be things that could be captured by the institution.
I imagined a spectrum that goes from chimps to Nietzsche, because recently I watched this amazingly filmed Netflix series called Chimp Empire about people living in the jungle with the largest and most documented group of chimps who were engaged in a kind of civil war. But what struck me looking at their faces with such close-up was they have more cognitive capacity than they have opportunity socially and physically to experiment with. So they have a lot of customs, they have a lot of oppressive hierarchies, they have a lot of sadism and masochism and violence and social infliction of distress. And it may be because they're bored, right? They don't have anything to do except make up mean soap opera games for each other. And so they will do that because they have more capacity than they have use for it. On the other hand, I thought of a too seldom read book by Nietzsche is the Wagner Case, where he tries to unpack the philosophy of the future of health in music. It's beautiful, but it starts with him saying, I listened again to Bizet's Carmen, and can you believe it? To sit for 9 hours is the first sign of holiness, he says. Right, and he paid a lot of attention to this problem of sitting still in a room. He has some very interesting passages that say, you know, if your energy, if your will to power flowing through you is not allowed to just leak out into your regular behaviors, if you sort of dam it up in a way and let it start to fill you, then what will happen? What will happen when it begins to overflow? He says, does it overflow into a god? He asks himself this question in the notebooks, right? So there's this, on the one hand, the problem of the boredom, and on the other hand, this ability to bring attention to bear in a very intense way that ceases to flow out into all the little tributary channels by which our attention is being co-opted, and allows it to build up in some kind of central reservoir, which seems very important. And it has to be internal as well as external, right? Leisure has to be internal as well as external. It's not just that I'm unplugged from social and material necessities. That's very important. But I also have to be unplugged from capture by the memes that are already running inside my nervous system. I need to have free consciousness. I need to have more attention than is getting captured in that sense. So a lot of what we see in both shamanic and in other forms of spiritual practice is the desire to accumulate the capacity for internal leisure as well, to be free from the things about yourself that are trying to monopolize your cognition.
Absolutely. I think the brain is the frenemy. It is your friend because it makes it possible to think, but it's also your enemy because it's doing everything in its power to get out of thinking or to replace it with counterfeits. And we don't often think of the things that make it possible for us to be human also as the things that try to make us unconscious or undead in different ways, right? And so the brain is the frenemy. I mean, thinking operates by focusing on things as if, like, when you think, I think about that bookcase, I separate it from the network of relations of the entire room, as I must do to think about it. Well, that's a problem, because that means I understand automatically in a risky situation where I can then separate the things from the relations in which it is coordinated in, right? And so thinking works by a kind of error. And, you know, this is where for Hegel, like, basically error becomes, now you got to move from understanding to reason, but that means you learn through error that you cannot avoid. The question is if you come to understand that it is an error so that you can then negate it, sublate it into reason, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what you're saying is very good. No, for me, like, what these internal capacities, internal leisure, et cetera, so forth, it kind of, basically, for me, if a way to think of it is intrinsic motivation, the ability to be the self-turning wheel, as Nietzsche said, right? And then I like to note that, like, book 5 of the Gay Science, which I find very interesting, is basically going through all of these examples of getting your understanding motivation from something external to you. You know, everyone knows he critiques religion. You know, you get your meaning from God, and that's bad. But then he critiques pragmatism, where you say, oh, only did it because it's practical. He's like, that's bad because you're kind of outsourcing the responsibility to what's practical. Science, you can outsource it. I did it because it's just scientific. He's like, oh, you're not thinking for yourself and taking responsibility. He goes through all the book on nationalism. He goes through all of these different things and critiques what I like to call bestowcentrism, which is not to say bestowing is always bad, because you require some bestowing, say from the elder or from the shaman, but we become reliant on the point that we're not able to operate unless something is bestowed to us, either by science, religion, nationality, pragmatism, whatever. And there's a critique of all that in favor of basically almost the capital W Schopenhauer will, in a way, where the ability to be kind of the will as the self-turning wheel becomes central. Now, that all has to be expounded upon, but it would suggest, for me, all of that is speaking to a kind of intrinsic motivation. And it does seem that the meaning of life is intrinsic motivation, because if you are intrinsically motivated, life has meaning. Like, if you are able to be intrinsically motivated, then your life has meaning, right? And that also makes space for difference. That makes space for different opinions, different roles. We're not saying the meaning of life is 42, therefore you must become a mathematician. We're saying the meaning of life is intrinsic motivation, because then your life, if you're intrinsically motivated, life has meaning. And that seems, what's interesting about that is then the test of intrinsic motivation is precisely what you do in a room by yourself. Like, if there's nothing going on, are you able to be a self-turning wheel in a room by yourself? Are you able to, and then meditation is precisely the greatest test of that ability to cultivate attention, because attention would be the manifestation of an intrinsic motivation. Can you actually do it? And it becomes this kind of great test. And it then makes me think, I guess I would be curious what you think about this. It makes me think, I guess, philosophically, when I think of what is kind of philosophy, I always think about philosophy as kind of personal defense. And I break it down also between, like, Socrates. If you start with Socrates, that's when you go wonder, right? You go the music, as Plato would talk about, you know, oh, there's this kind of wonder. What is a coffee cup? This kind of absurd act. It's like, oh my gosh, you're struck by being. Maybe you're struck by boredom. What does it mean that I can get bored? Then for me, you kind of can think about Heidegger with the clearing, where you create a clearing. You're like, you have wonder. Then you create a clearing where being can disclose itself. But then you have to have the Martin Buber waiting, as Javier would talk about, where you wait in that clearing for what can disclose itself and for the cultivation of your own intrinsic motivation. But then you also require Hume, because for Hume, philosophy is self-defense. You have to have the ability to defend yourself from the ideas. that are infringing upon your clearing, that are infringing upon your wonder, that are saying that's stupid or a waste of time. So you have to defend against institutional capture. You have to fight against the paradigms of usefulness in a kind of reductionist way, bestow centricity. So you need the Socrates, the wonder, life, Heidegger, clearing. Then you need waiting, and then self-defense. I did hand motions with that. Maybe that could be a dance. I don't know. So, Socrates, Heidegger, waiting, and then defense. And all of those, for me, are kind of the skills that create that space for the cultivation of the intention and intrinsic motivation. And without that, if you don't have wonder, then you're never going to stop and go, wait, what is life? So you can't move to attention without wonder. But then you also need a clearing by which you kind of move the temptations of standing reserve, the temptations of reductionism, you clear those out, then you wait. You don't say, well, now I know what to do, because now you have intention. That seems to be the risk. You created a clearing, and then you move into attention as opposed to attention. So you need to do the Buber waiting, if you will. And then in that, you also have to be able to self-defense and defend that space of clearing. And if you can't do that, then you're going to lose it. So it's like you have to have all of those things to cultivate the attention. And if we don't do that, well, then you're just you have to fall into capture. You have to fall into the nihilism and different things like that. But then also you have to be able to handle the difficulty and the pain of which comes from being in that clearing. And then if you don't have a rationality that allows you to think of pain as something you need to go through, or grit as something you need to go through, you can't even maintain that clearing space. So all of that, like when we think of philosophy as systems building, like building this giant system that gets to the truth of the world, you don't have this mode of being able to think about it as wonder, clearing, wait, self-defense. And if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to cultivate attention.
I think the self-defense component is essential, particularly in the kind of world that we're unfolding at the moment, right? It seems to me that the Taoists were good at articulating a certain benevolent skepticism toward established forms. Right? The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. There's a distance being proposed, an adjacency relative to the immediately perceived or bestowed meaning of things. But that was a luxury item for people that wanted to drop out of ancient Chinese society and pursue wisdom development. Under the conditions in which we are besieged by incoming social information, where, famously, people might receive a tweet and be so upset they kill themselves or something like that, right? Where we're constantly victimized, let's say, or made vulnerable by our belief in the obviousness of incoming digital and social information, then that kind of Taoist suspicion about passive forms against the bestowed form, that becomes a survival necessity, because each day now is a situation where we are objectively less able to believe in the forms we're being presented. Right. Every day, the ability of people and devices to generate apparent realities is going to get stronger and stronger. So you can't believe that a message that came from your friend necessarily came from them. You can't believe video footage or audio footage, or, right, if the AI can generate a document that has the backstory that proves all the references to a very plausible argument it's making, it can spin that up in a moment, then we're in a situation where we have to, all of us, philosophically confront information and perception as dubious. But we then have to learn the emotional skill of maintaining good relationships and a good conscience under conditions of heightened skepticism. But I think the real flaw, the flaw to which the sages have anciently pointed, is we are always endangered by passive perception. And it might be the extravagant danger of an omni-simulating universe, or it might be the normal danger of not getting the nutrition we need from our perceptions because we're not putting any work into that. So it's not just about the defensive stance of not being deluded by perceptions. It's about, now that you've sort of contextualized or bracketed your perception to some workable degree, then what do you do with that? How do you make that into a real perception? This is where it would come to a kind of Gurdjieffian discourse, where he would say, you're not being spiritually nourished by passive perception. If you see a dog and recognize it as a dog, your brain has used the least amount of cognitive energy it can use. As a result, you get the least nourishing perception that's possible. If you wanted a nourishing perception, a perception that would contribute to the overall sense of the self-turning wheel of your being, then you would need to do some additional effort relative to things which are otherwise occurring passively. And his example of that is you have to try to connect your perception with some other kind of resonant perception from a different internal system. So, for example, you see a postman. You're like, a postman. But do I know what emotion goes with a postman? Do I know what physical thing in my body goes with a postman? Those are not immediately apparent to us. I can put him in a mimetic category very simply and not use much cognitive energy. But if I want to connect it across different systems in my nervous system, then I'm going to have to make an effort to thwart my brain's tendency to silo these things. When I do that, I get a much richer sense of the world, and I contribute to a generalized sense of myself that starts to become very satisfying and compelling over time, but only if I'm actively willing to do work for processes that otherwise seem to happen on their own.
That's magnificent. And the phrase you use, nutrition from perception, I really liked, because often we kind of think, how do I avoid being deceived? Well, that's all well and good, but then there's a different question of how are you get nutrients from what you do perceive. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, and we have to move to the positive. To me, I put a lot of emphasis on beauty, because when things are beautiful, which doesn't just mean pretty, there's something deeper going on in the classical sense, then beauty is nutritious. Right? It gives you like reason. That is beautiful, therefore I care. Beauty creates motivation as well. If I find it beautiful, then I am motivated to go toward it, to treat it a certain way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it should be noted that like beauty also deals with the problem of time, because when you find something beautiful, you don't feel like time goes away. That's where, like, when like Dante or all of them talk about a beatific vision, there's this notion of, if you believe in heaven, how can you be in heaven and not be bored? Well, that's because you don't think about time. There is no experience of time. It just goes away. It melts away in a way. So there is, boredom is a product of time just going on where you forget about the concept of time, really. It's not that it goes away, but it's negated, sublated in the beauty. So there's a way in which beauty is actually the disclosure of time in its fullness. And so it just kind of melts away. So likewise, if you get nutrition from your perception, from your experience, well, then time kind of goes away in the way that you're waiting for it to go away. Suddenly you're like wishing for more time. That seems to be one of the great metrics of success, is if you can move life from something where you're trying to get through the day to trying to keep the day going, right? That seems to be quite healthy. And I'm always taken, it would be a different subject and I have no science to back it in any way whatsoever, but I'm always very interested on why is it that so many like intellectuals, philosophers, artists, assuming they don't get cancer or sick, they like live into their 90s. Like a lot of them live a really long time. And I do wonder if that's because if you've got like a work or something you think is important, that literally like feeds you physically. Like if you have attention, if you have something that you think matters to you and you're like wanting more time, then you actually carry yourself through life in a way that leads to you having more time. Obviously, you still die, everyone dies, but it is interesting. And I think there's been research out of UVA, although again, I'm not a scientist, I don't get I'm not sure, that actually connects the immune system to the brain now, where before they thought they were separated. Well, it would be interested in the health of the brain, the frontal cortex based on attention. And it does seem that the literal health of your brain is tied to your ability to have attention. Well, if that's the case, that might actually be health-wise quite good. And we put a lot of emphasis on exercise as elongating life and avoiding sickness. But it's just always interesting to me how many of these people who have their own project, if you will, who care about something, live a long time. Not always, I'm not trying to make a big claim, but it would suggest that that there's something there about the ability to actually physically connect with our mental states and how that has something to do with our relation to time in general. I also think absolutely the cultivation of attention will be necessary given AI. An essay I really like, David Foster Wallace wrote a book called, an essay called Up Simba, and he's following the McCain campaign, and this was 2000, early 2000s, and he's asking the question, How do you know when McCain is genuine or not? You know, the running for president. When is he a politician and when is he real? And he says, and I remind you, everyone, David Foster Wallace says, this was the man who was imprisoned and tortured and stay in torture during the war for a military code. He was offered the ability to leave early, but did not because it was not honorable according to the military code. So he's like, this is a man who we have every reason to believe is genuine, every reason to believe is a good person, but the moment he enters onto the campaign trail, he's in a black box. There's no getting in, there's no getting out. We can't tell what's real, what's not. And he ends the essay saying, try to stay awake. And I always like that phrase because basically the entire world is going to find itself in a state of trying to stay awake, where everything feels like a black box, where the real is dead, as Baudrillard said, where we can't tell, where the fake and the living are all mixed together. And it would seem that the cultivation of attention is going to be utterly necessary in that state where one is exhausted by questioning their perceptions as being real or fake. And there's going to be an exhaustion that kind of comes from that, almost like the Barth essay, The Literature of Exhaustion, where there's an exhaustion that will come from that, where then we have to actually be able to have an attention to it where we find it beautiful. And it would seem that if we're looking for our nutrition, if we're looking for our perceptions to give us nutrition externally, it's not going to do that. It's going to exhaust us and we're going to give up. We have to somehow internally have the resources to then have our perceptions be nutritious because of the internal resources that are able to put those on the world. If we're looking for the black box of reality, as David Foster Wallace puts it, to give us nutrition, that's not going to happen because the real is dead in a Baudrillard sense. We're going to have to be able to provide those inner resources ourselves. But that would mean we have to cultivate the ability to self-defend the things working to destroy our internal resources. And like just an example, and then I'll give it back to you, is that like for David Hume, the reason he separates is and ought is because if someone can come along and tell you what you are, and therefore can tell you what you ought to do, they can control you. So he's trying to separate is and ought precisely to defend people. He wants to replace is with suchness. You determine what you should do, like should you get a new tire for your car, you base that on the suchness of your particular car and your particular experience, and you determine what you ought to do from suchness, but not the category of isness. He says, if we get a world where oughtness is determined from what a car is in an abstract sense, not a particular sense, we're screwed. But a lot of people basically thought David Hume was just destroying ethics by separating is from ought. What he's trying to do is locate the ethical in the immediate of common life. Everything in Hume is about defending particularity in common life. He's been read as a skeptic when really he's dealing with the problem of philosophy as being necessary, but also the great danger. That's where he comes from, the ancient tradition where philosophy is its own greatest problem because it has a tendency to create abstract categories that have nothing to do with reality. So he's deconstructing is from ought in order to bound ought to suchness. Likewise, he's trying to decouple identity from an abstract idea of self and basing it in the lived immediate experience of Daniel versus humanity. And so there are all these moves in Hume that are acts of self-defense, because if you don't do that, you lose your internal resources and now you're going to be captured. Now the system is going to tell you what the human is, therefore what the human ought to do, and now you don't have control over your life. And that ability to defend suchness is absolutely tied to attention, because suchness exists in the realm of attention, in the immediate. And if you cannot defend that, then you're in huge, huge trouble. And so Hume is all in that. And we really do exist in a world now where everything is categorized in terms of isness, and therefore given an oughtness according to that itness, that then leads to us not defending suchness and not cultivating oughtness. So then we don't control our lives. We don't control our lives at all.
To the point of the nutritious potential of perception, I think there's a strong argument that something like that characterized the bulk of the shamanic traditions in human history, and that it's associated with things that we would now look back on maybe somewhat dismissively as the reading of omens or being in conversation with the distributed animistic powers of the environment. But those are modes of approaching the world where we say to ourselves, my perception of that mountain, my perception of that crow, my perception of that cloud has something to tell me that's pertinent, that's meaningful if I respond to that in a particular way. So I'm viewing them as engaged in an imaginal participatory form of perceiving the world in a way that enriches their own wisdom development to the point where it can be of service to the tribe. As to the thing about Hume, I've never heard it quite put that way. That's a very interesting way to describe it. And I think one of the things that's been problematic in civilized religion and spirituality has been the tendency to become nihilistic through becoming impersonal, right? That we understand that the personal quality you show up with is incomplete, problematic. We might call that sinful. We might call that ignorant. We might call that smaller than we want. We might call it the ego, but whatever it is, the situation you show up with is not, you don't feel awesome all the time. You have an existential problem. So what do? You want to get beyond your personal experience of feeling insufficient existentially. But it's been proposed in a lot of the great axial age traditions that the way you do that is to move away from the particular, away from the embodied, away from the biological, toward the increasingly abstract and impersonal. You leave matter and life and pets and women down there with emotions, and you move to an empty consciousness that becomes disembodied and maybe even surrenders consciousness itself into some kind of utter ultimate sublimity. I think what we're seeing now through the work of healthy embodiment-oriented sages throughout history, now being compiled as we have access to all of humanity's records, and through the resurgence of things like shamanism, is a kind of spirituality that moves from the impersonal to the hyperpersonal or the suprapersonal as the goal, as a way of, yes, going beyond your personal limitations of the self-enclosed, existentially insufficient self, but in a way that moves toward that which is more particular, more peculiar, more embodied, something which accesses the information that's underlying your own sensations, your own emotions, your own inner conflicts, your own dreams. I've been using this phrase lately. We're looking for a system with strong transcendence and preeminent immanence, right? That we're looking for it to show up in the specific, not to escape from the specific into the universal. And I think Nietzsche does a very good job of critiquing the nihilistic results that you get when you allow religion to start to speak the language of the universal at the expense of the locally embodied suchness of the circumstance. So we need a real transcendental drive, but we need it to pursue its objectives by re-inhabiting our world more deeply, by coming in to the specifics of the circumstance, by entering and fulfilling the promise of the unique rather than escaping the unique into the generalized and ultimately the universalized abstraction of the impersonal per se.
Magnificent. It makes me think of that part where the guy comes up to Father Zosima and the brothers Karamazov and says, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. I came to love humanity and lost the ability to love an individual. And, Dostoevsky is always critiquing this idea of the tendency to love humanity, but not love individuals. And he was saying that the modern world tends to be cultivated in this, and this tends to be an abstract love that proves a source of totalitarianism and destruction. And David Hume, indeed, Hume, I fear, is not, I'm critical. There are scholars like Livingston and Norman K. Smith that go through and say this reading of Hume as an empiricist is kind of absurd. And it's actually missing a lot of where he's really in the business of making us understand that philosophy is in the business of self-defense, and that philosophy is its own worst problem, and you can't reduce his thinking to empiricism. It's a defense of particularity. And generally, I think I'm a big fan of what I like to call the modern counter-enlightenment. I believe there was a movement of philosophy that was completely ignored. You can start it with the counter-enlightenment, as Berlin will talk about, with Foucault, Harman, the Scottish Enlightenment, but there actually is a movement. I would actually put Hegel in it with his emphasis on the concrete. That is the modern counter-enlightenment that's going to be going through thinkers like Marcis Blondel on action, the extraordinary Michel Planier in personal knowledge, which I'll comment on, Benjamin Fontaine, this movement of thought that basically is saying that philosophy without suchness, relations, I know that Vervaeke is talking about Neoplatonism. The way that he's talking about Neoplatonism, I would absolutely situate with the modern counter-enlightenment that was ignored. So basically, let's take an example of Michel Planier's personal knowledge. He makes the warning that if you do not place the person as the most axiomatic foundation of your thinking, you are doomed, because the person is the ground of the reality of human life. And so for example, he basically is nominated for a Nobel Prize in chemistry. He's a huge scientist. He's quite famous, but he's also aware that if you define knowledge purely in terms of scientific categories and you lose the person, then the only way to understand the human is as a biological entity. And basically, he's talking about emergentism before emergentism is a thing. And he's like, but we are assuming that there is no reality to other layers of science and that the person is not more fundamental than the human. And he says something very profound. At what point, and Leslie Newbegin in his book, Proper Confidence, which is also quite good, quote, kind of says it this way. He says that for Planier, only statements of which can be false have any chance of contact with reality. Only statements that may be false have any possibility of contact with reality. And I know we talked about that with Dimitri, but the reason that is the case is because the person could be wrong. But it's precisely because the person can be wrong that they can create, that they can change, that they actually are alive, or that something can emerge. And what he wants to say that if we define knowledge as that which cannot be wrong, then we are defining knowledge that by definition must be non-conditional, it must be abstract. It must be about humanity, not individuals. And he says, as you make that movement, you are also empowering systems and totalitarian and institutions, because institutions can only control with abstract knowledge. If knowledge must be particular, you can't have the government telling everyone what to do or corporations controlling people, because every single person is a decentralization of the basis of that oughtness. And so if you move away from the personal, and if you move away from the possibility of personal knowledge, that is setting you up for totalitarianism. And he warns about the 20th century and all of these different things. So the loss of the person becomes massively consequential, because then, well, what that also will do is you can't have perception be nutritious. And what I mean by that is, when you were talking, I can't help but think of In Praise of Shadows by, I can never say his name, Tasagani, where he talks about in the Japanese aesthetic, the shadow was a big deal, right? And he said the West is screwed and totalitarian basically because it has the artificial light that's really bright. It's either super dark, it's either on or off. There's no conditioning of light. There's no like working to change how you experience the room, right? And what he's talking about is, if you have, I like to talk about between subjectivity and objectivity, I like to talk about conditionalism, which is not the same as relativism. And I think it's very similar to Vervaeke's grip, where he talks about the grip, the optimal grip thing, right? And it's like you literally can impact the lighting of the room in a manner that very tangibly impacts your experience of that room, right? It's not simply the light is on or the light is off. You can work to condition the room to change your experience of the room. We talk about the atmosphere, the vibe, lo-fi, we can talk, like there's a sign of condition and experience, right? Well, there's no space for that without personal knowledge. Like the possibility or the idea of the concreteness of the condition doesn't really have space for our thinking if we only have broad abstract categories, right? But if instead the personal or the relational, or people talk about communal ontology, like if that is actually the basis of reality, that emergent phenomenon, and when we say basis, I know that's all difficult because you would say all levels of the stack is simultaneous, but the point is that the idea of making perception nutritious would require you to have a category in your thinking of the capacity to condition your perceptions, because you do a work to make your perceptions beautiful. If you literally said, wait a minute, I could change the lighting in my library and change the effect of it. Wait a minute, I could change how I hold myself in conversations and change the nature of the conversation. Wait a minute, I can use my time differently and change the kind of atmospheres I am in and that I create. Well, suddenly everything changes. Suddenly everything becomes, I actually have the capacity to make my perceptions nutritious. But we haven't had a category in our ontology of metaphysics where that is even plausible. Either perception is nutritious or it's not. The lights are on or the lights are off. We don't have any conditioning power. But once you realize, wait a minute, conditionalism is real. Wait a minute, we as human beings have the ability to condition because personal knowledge is knowledge, because the personal and the individual and the suchness is real and arguably most real. Well, then conditioning that is actually contact with reality. We're not deluding ourselves, because that's what people think, oh, you're deluding yourself to condition. Oh, you're making an illusion. No, 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 no. Actually, if the personal is making contact with reality, that conditioning is actually creating conditions by which truth, goodness, and beauty can emerge, and therefore perception can be nutritious versus not. So the notion, so the entire modern, the entire modern counter-enlightenment in that business of conditioning, we just don't think that we as human beings can condition reality that actually makes it more true in that conditioning that would actually help make perceptions nutritious. And it would seem that the shamans are very much in the business of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I would think of three different general approaches to making perception nutritious. Right. And the one is what you were just talking about, the one that's involved in the skill set that brings us toward ritual and sacred spaces. And this is one of the things the shamans bring to the rest of the tribe. How do we generate the conditions of mood and context that act like nutritious perceptions? How do we give people the right kind of entertainment, the right kind of cathedral, number of different ways to approach it, the right kind of space in which they are more likely to experience their perception as something that nourishes and elevates and transforms and clarifies and restores. So that's one of the skill sets. Another one, like we've been talking about, is how do you do your actual perceiving, right? And what is your internal and neurological and interintelligence strategy for the act of perception itself? And then the third one is what's the discourse, what's the critique that's involved in trying to figure out which of our perceptions actually might be more nutritious in general, right? Because we have people who are, let's say, the kind of people who want to make sure that nobody sees aggression, ambiguity, skepticism, nudity, right? You should really just be looking at things that are bland and aspirational and reinforce the in-group qualities of the village. We want to make sure that nobody, especially the children, they're always very worried about the children seeing the wrong things. So they have an idea that there's some better nutrition food. But of course, we look at these people and they're very often the worst kind of people in many ways. They seem to be suffering from social pathology in many cases. So they can't be relied upon to tell us what's a nutritious perception, even though they make a strong argument that some things might be better for you to look at than others. But if we want to actually figure what those things are, we need a robust philosophical discourse that would try to probe perception to see which classes are more likely to have nutritious qualities. When we look at what's nutritious in nature, very often it requires a lot of chewing, requires a lot of cleaning, has very strange, complex forms, things like that, right? If we thought, what's a nutritious form of entertainment as perception food, we might be thinking, I should watch the latest David Lynch movie rather than I should watch some bland religious after-school special or whatever the imam wants to show me. Like we need to really start to think clearly about what kinds of perceptions are likely to be a high nutrient source. So those three areas I think are important if we were going to, say, generate a dharma around perception as nutrient.
I love that. And I think that's exactly right. I think generally, even just this very thinking of making perception nutritious, that's not a thought people have. They're like, what object do I get? What thing do I get? And that leads to trouble because I can get you into psychoanalysis, Lacan, and all those different things. And basically, the moment you set yourself up for an object, well, then you're going to encounter the real eventually. That kind of breaks through. But instead, if the thought is, well, wait a minute, how does one make perception nutritious? That seems to be an entirely different thing. And then, indeed, if one could make perception nutritious, one could cultivate friendships of which could share in that nutritious perception. And then, of course, there would be a gratitude and a respect toward those of whom could cultivate that nutritious experience. And alas, I will have to run to the mechanic in about 10 or so minutes, but I've enjoyed this a lot, Layman Pascal. So some other thing, like you were saying on Gurdjieff, it's interesting because it's almost like intention is consciousness. I intend X, where subconscious can be like attention or the ability to master subconscious. And I know that Gurdjieff, he would kind of talk about the subconscious as almost being consciousness, as in like more pivotal than consciousness. And it's interesting to think that when one cultivates the ability of attention, a kind of phenomenological sign of that is almost an excitement about what the subconscious will present to you. Like, oh, there's a new idea. Oh, a new story idea. Oh, a new insight. Oh, like you almost get excited about what can come from the subconscious. Whereas when you don't cultivate attention, it's almost like you're afraid of the subconscious. Like there's some scary things that can come out. It's like this terror that you're always trying to repress. And so I'm interested with his emphasis on the subconscious. It almost is like when you're talking about this ability to kind of optimize and attune to different thought patterns, it's almost like a sign of that is of intrinsic motivation, of attention, is where the subconscious becomes this, yeah, there's some like challenges and, you could say dark things that come up. You can talk about Jung and all that, but there's also a kind of like, oh my gosh, things can come out of the subconscious that are exciting. Things can kind of emerge, ideas, because it's also like Viveki, and then we'll talk about with Dialogos. When you're in, when you do a Dialogos, things come up you didn't expect, you never thought of that before, boom, it's just kind of there, and you get this kind of excitement, and it's almost like a life of surprise, right? Like the surprise tends to be a source of a lot of joy. And it seems like attention is where you get to the place where you cultivated yourself and thus your subconscious in a manner that where it can surprise you in a joyful way. And then funny enough, if you can be your own source of surprise, well, then that leads to a self-turning wheel, intrinsic motivation, and then sort of looking forward to what might come out of you. And then that, if the shaman is like, how do you transform the subconscious into something you look forward to? And then, of course, you'd want to identify with it, right? You'd want to identify with that sort of thing that brings forth stuff that's unexpected, as opposed to just identifying with your consciousness that's intention. Because the intention is always a reduction of the thing that causes these surprises that are so exciting. And so when you start identifying with your subconscious, it's almost like then you are identifying with that mystery. You're identifying with that thing that brings forth all of these unexpected. And it would seem like another part of then the equation of the meaning crisis, the intrinsic motivation, et cetera, so forth, is actually getting to the place where one is so conditioned that the subconscious becomes something you look forward to, as opposed to something you're scared. But that would require facing all the dragons and demons of the subconscious as well.
Yeah, the question about how do you make the conscious mind a better assistant to the subconscious unfolding of wisdom and spirituality is a very profound one. And even in a lot of the developmental communities, the emphasis seems to be, the default is that your waking state socialized personality is the agent that's going to undergo these levels of existential unfolding. But we also know that your primary intelligence is largely subconscious.
Yep.
So what does it mean if we shift toward that? We start to say, okay, maybe there are developmental levels, but I need to get my subconscious to grow and develop and become wiser so that it can work with and through me. So then my job as the conscious mind is to be a good assistant to that process. How do I bring it the food that it needs to process? How do I get better at hearing its signals? How do I get better at bearing the unpleasant shadow material and contradictions between the different facets of itself? How do I become a better friend to its mysteries? To the point where, like you're saying, it starts to function thoroughly enough that I'm constantly going, wow, that was really neat. I want to help out with this process more often. One of the things you see in Gurdjieff, but you also see it in a lot of indigenous traditions, is people undertaking a developmental discipline of acting on some subconscious prompts. There's a beautiful section in Graeber and Wengrau's book on the Dawn of Everything where they talk about North American indigenous nations where acting out things that came to you in your dreams was taken to be a viable and moral and practical activity. So there's a lot of things where you might get a prompt that comes out of your subconscious, and if you cause yourself to fulfill that or act on that, you set up a different kind of circuitry. And we see artists do this, right? The Surrealist movement is famously a kind of explosion of the shamanic dimension within art history. But they're trying to, if Salvador Dali is going to paint a very strange thing that he came up with, he's not just expressing himself, he's disciplining himself to manifest a thing that came out of his subconscious intelligence. He's making himself a better servant of that, which can be expressive, it can be an action, but it can also be an input, a better servant in terms of bringing the nutritious material to that other thing and viewing yourself essentially as a mystery to yourself that you can be a good assistant to. And I think that's one of the things that the shamanic brings in, because although there's a lot of really nice elements to the Buddhist, the Islamic, the Christian, the Judaic, all of the sort of axial age religious systems, one of the things they tend to do is this basic modern mistake, is exaggerating the degree to which the socialized waking state consciousness is the agent. Whereas the shamanic and to some degree the magical and occult approach is to treat the agency as a mysterious other set of capacities within and as the individual.
That's very magnificent, and it also just makes me think like when that Einstein book by Isaacson where he talks about like and Bertrand Russell said this too to McGee, where like what you see is like in a genius like Einstein, the reason they're a genius is because they're really good daydreamers. Like he wasn't, there were some people who said he was good at math but not as good as other people, but the reason that made like Einstein so great is because he could imagine a glass elevator flying in the sky, or what would a clock tower look like at the speed of light. Well, the power was the daydreaming actually. And then it's of course very problematic because if people think the genius of Einstein is actually his conscious ability, which of course was very capable, and you don't have that daydreaming ability, you actually lose where so much of the power comes out of nowhere. And like when you look at a book like Randall Collins' Sociological of Intellectual Change, or these different things, like genius tends to be this thing that just comes from the nowhere. But we don't, it's almost like we have to cultivate, I want to be friends with this mystery, right? Like the cultivation of you are a mystery, and then that's interesting because it does speak also to like Heidegger's clearing, where we put so much emphasis on the thinking rational cognito. We haven't thought about how do I cultivate myself as a clearing for these kind of apophatic mystery, this apophatic fullness that is the subconscious mind that kind of comes forth. I think part of the problem is we think of the subconscious as the subconscious below, and it's kind of like subpar. There's a language there that makes it like less than or negative or other, when really if instead we thought about the conscious mind as the gardener and the subconscious was the garden, well then everything is about that garden because something might bloom. So we have a language problem there with sub that makes it seem like it's lesser than, when actually everything seems to be in the business of using intentional thought to create the clearing and then defend that clearing and waiting in that clearing for the garden to sprout, for the mystery to come forth. And I think that change of thinking, what thinking is in the business of, thinking is in the business of making the space for the mystery that you have, then that changes everything. That changes how you do education. That changes how you do social interaction. And it also goes to speak, like Roger Scruton had that part where he said, the symbols you put in yourself, the books you read, these things really do matter. Like it really matters what you read and what you do. Well, it makes a lot more sense then, because those are the very things you're putting in your mystery that come out. And if you're not putting anything in your mystery, then nothing is going to bloom. Nothing is going to come out. And it makes life way more exciting, right? Like we're looking for excitement in consuming and going out. But if instead we say, no, you have the source of your own excitement, if you so condition it, like the shadow and touch of God, if you so condition yourself and you defend it, you have it there. You have it there if you so cultivate it. It can come out, and then and if you stay with it, and you stay with it through your life, like persevere in it and condition and discipline it, all of that seems to suddenly go, wait a minute, I have everything I need for the meaning crisis. Wait a minute, I have everything I need with nihilism. Now, if you take that seriously, I do think that means you have to take seriously the self-deception, the irony, the real, the ways we are monsters and hide from ourselves. There's like you were saying, absolutely, there's a kind of challenge that comes from this. And this is where I think the psychoanalytic is so important, because you have to go through the real and the pathos and face that and deal with the difficulties of yourself. But if you can deal with that challenge, that monster, well, then you can unlock that mystery. And suddenly you have all within yourself a kind of hero's quest, right? You have all within yourself the certain conditions, if we would only have the shamans that would help us guide us in that direction. And it definitely would seem that we need that shaman today. And so I'm very grateful for your work, Layman Pascal. It's a pleasure to speak with you. If you have any closing remarks, please. I am so sad that I must run, but I've really enjoyed this. I'd love to do it again, because I think, because the other thing my mind goes to is the problem of scale, the problem of education systems. What does it look like to scale? Osho has that part where he basically is like, don't worry about governments, because if we elevate consciousness, government will melt away. You don't need to worry about revolution, because if consciousness is elevated, he describes it almost like I think he says like dewdrops, where when you revolt against government, that doesn't do it because you're not ready for the freedom. So it's kind of like this evolutionary anarchism that he almost is describing, which is interesting. And there are moments where I think that's exactly right. And then there are moments where I think that's really naive. And I keep going back and forth, and I've gone through it 1,000 times in the problem of scale for the part 2 of belonging, again, the address. But I'm going to resist opening that can, which is very terrible of me. But I think about that a lot on the role of institutions, and can the elevation of consciousness just deal with it just in that very elevation, or is there something else that needs to be done? That's a big one for me. But that's a terrible thing to do, to like point at something and then say you have to go. That's like the worst, isn't it, Layman? I'm sorry.
Yeah, here's all the very exciting things we're not going to talk about right now. But this has been absolutely lovely. I have a great time talking with you, and let's consider it to be part 1 of a discussion that will move into institutions and scale in a more thorough way next time.
Oh, I would love that. Oh my goodness, I would love that. Well, Layman Pascal, I've enjoyed it very much. I know, and I didn't even get a chance on the Meta Shaman. I hope we covered some of it. I know you've had that talk with the great Tim Adlin, so I will tell everyone to go to Voicecraft for more on that. And then the integral stage. And you also are a lovely writer, so everyone go to Layman's Substack and all of his work in general. Well, Layman Pascal, I have enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much for your time, and may you have a wonderful day. And thank you so much, sir.
You too. Thank you, my friend.